Caesar stood on the northern bank with his soldiers behind him. 51 years old, greying at the temples, wearing the red cloak of a Roman commander. For 8 years he'd been fighting in Gaul, winning battles, making himself rich and famous. Now he had a problem. Roman law was clear. No general could bring his army into Italy. Cross this river with your legions and you're a traitor. But Caesar's enemies in Rome were waiting for him. They wanted to destroy him the moment he came home without his soldiers to protect him. So there he was, cross the river and start a civil war, stay in Gaul and let his enemies win. Either choice would change everything. His men watched him think. These weren't just any soldiers. They'd followed him through forests and swamps, across rivers and mountains. They'd made him the most successful general Rome had seen in generations. Caesar looked at the water one more time. Then he said the words that would echo through history, Alia iacta est. The die is cast. What happened next didn't just change Rome, it changed the world. But to understand why Caesar made that choice, we need to go back. Back to the Rome he grew up in. A Rome that was tearing itself apart. Picture Rome in 100 BC, the year Caesar was born. The city had grown beyond anything the world had ever seen. 1 million people crowded into neighbourhoods that climbed the 7 hills like a human anthill. The Forum buzzed with merchants selling everything from British tin to Chinese silk. Roman roads stretched from Scotland to the Sahara Desert. But here's the thing. Rome was still being run like a small Italian city-state. The same laws that worked when Rome controlled just a few miles around the Tiber River were now supposed to govern an empire that spanned 3 continents. It was like trying to run a modern corporation with the rules of a neighbourhood lemonade stand. The cracks were showing everywhere. Take the army, for example. For centuries, Roman soldiers had been citizen farmers who fought for a few months, then went home to their fields. But now Rome needed armies that could campaign for years in distant provinces. Who was going to tend the farms while the soldiers were gone? Who was going to feed their families? A man named Gaius Marius figured out the answer. He opened the army to the landless poor, gave them weapons, training, and the promise of land when they retired. Suddenly, Rome had professional soldiers who were loyal not to the state, but to the general who fed them and promised them a future. Marius himself was a fascinating character. Born in a small hill town called Arpinum, he wasn't from one of Rome's ancient noble families. He was what they called a new man, someone who had to fight for every step up the ladder. He had scars on his face from a Germanic spear and hands that were rough from years of holding a sword. The aristocrats looked down on him, but the soldiers loved him. Marius won battles that saved Rome from destruction. Germanic tribes had been pouring into Italy like a flood, burning cities and killing everyone in their path. At a place called Aquae Sextiae, Marius crushed them so completely that the threat disappeared forever. Rome was safe, but Marius had changed something fundamental. His soldiers didn't care about the Senate or the Constitution. They cared about their general. And when their general told them to march on Rome itself, they marched. It happened in 88 BC, when Caesar was just 12 years old. Marius and his rival Sulla both wanted command of a war against King Mithridates in the east. The Senate gave it to Sulla. Marius convinced his soldiers to take it by force. For the first time in Roman history, a Roman army entered the sacred boundary of the city as conquerors. Sulla fled, but he had his own armies in the south. When he came back, he brought them with him. What followed was horror. Sulla's men hunted Marius's supporters through the streets of Rome. They nailed lists of condemned men to the Forum walls, the first proscription lists in Roman history. If your name appeared on those boards, you were dead. Anyone could kill you and claim a reward. Young Caesar watched this happen, saw neighbours disappear in the night, heard the screams echoing from the Palatine Hill, where Sulla's men tortured information from their prisoners. The boy who would one day rule the world learned his first lesson about power. Mercy was a luxury that could get you killed. Sulla won, eventually. Marius died of natural causes, some said from rage and wine, before the final battle. but the damage was done. Romans had learned that their constitution was just words on bronze tablets. Real power came from the loyalty of armed men. Sulla tried to fix things. He passed laws limiting the power of tribunes, expanding the Senate, forcing magistrates to wait longer between offices. He thought he could restore the old republic through legislation. Then, in 79 BC, he did something that shocked everyone. He gave up power voluntarily and retired to his villa to write memoirs and chase young boys. But the precedent was set. Rome could be ruled by one man. The only question was which one. Other ambitious men were watching and learning. Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, Pompey the Great, had earned his nickname by winning victories in Spain and the East while still in his 20s. Marcus Licinius Crassus had become the richest man in Rome by buying burning buildings at bargain prices, then putting out the fires with his private fire brigade. Both men commanded armies. Both men wanted glory. The Senate tried to play them against each other, but that was like trying to control two tigers with pieces of meat. Eventually the tigers would realize they could take whatever they wanted. There were other warning signs too. In 73 BC, a gladiator named Spartacus broke out of a training school in Capua with 73 other fighters. Within months, he had an army of 120,000 escaped slaves that crushed Roman legions and terrorized Italy for 2 years. It took both Crassus and Pompey to finally hunt him down. The Spartacus rebellion showed how fragile Roman control really was. Millions of slaves worked the farms and mines that fed the empire. What would happen if they all decided to follow Spartacus's example? Even Rome's allies were getting restless. Italian cities that had fought beside Rome for centuries were still treated as second-class citizens. They couldn't vote in Roman elections or hold Roman offices, even though they bled for Roman victories. In 91 BC, they finally rebelled in what became known as the Social War, the War of the Allies. Rome won that war too, but only by giving the Italians what they wanted: citizenship. Suddenly, Roman citizenship meant something different. You didn't have to be born in Rome to be Roman. You just had to prove your loyalty to the Roman state. This was revolutionary. Other ancient empires ruled through conquest and tribute. Rome was creating something new, a system where conquered peoples could become Roman themselves. It was brilliant and dangerous at the same time. Brilliant because it gave millions of people a stake in Rome's success. Dangerous because it meant Rome was no longer a city ruling an empire, but an idea that could spread anywhere. The old families, the ones whose ancestors had founded the Republic, watched these changes with growing alarm. Their Rome was disappearing. The Rome where a few hundred noble families controlled everything, where citizenship meant something exclusive, where tradition mattered more than innovation. Some of them tried to fight back. The Gracchi brothers, Tiberius and Gaius, had pushed for land reforms to help poor citizens in the previous century. Both had been murdered by conservative senators who saw them as dangerous revolutionaries. Their deaths taught ambitious politicians another lesson. Reform could be fatal. But the problems kept getting worse. Rome's armies brought back incredible wealth from conquered territories. Gold from Spain, silver from Macedonia, slaves from everywhere. But most of that wealth went to the generals and their friends. The small farmers who had made Rome great found themselves competing with slave-worked estates owned by absentee landlords. Many gave up and moved to Rome itself, where they survived on free grain distributions and occasional bribes from politicians. The city filled with angry, unemployed citizens who had nothing to lose and everything to gain from supporting anyone who promised them a better life. This was the world Caesar was born into, a world where the old rules were breaking down, where violence had become normal, where ambitious men with loyal armies could take whatever they wanted, a world that was waiting for someone bold enough to grab it all. The republic that had conquered the Mediterranean was eating itself alive, and in that chaos a young man with the right combination of intelligence, ambition and ruthlessness could rise higher than anyone had ever imagined. Caesar was watching, Caesar was learning, and Caesar was getting ready to play a game where the stakes were nothing less than the future of human civilization. Into this dangerous world on July 12th in the year 100 BC A baby was born who would change everything. His parents named him Gaius Julius Caesar, after his father. They had no idea they were naming the future master of the world. The Caesar family lived in the Suburra, one of Rome's most crowded neighbourhoods. This wasn't where you'd expect to find a future emperor. The Suburra was loud, smelly, and packed with ordinary Romans trying to make a living. Bakers worked before dawn, filling the air with the smell of fresh bread. Blacksmiths hammered metal in tiny workshops. Prostitutes called to customers from upper-story windows. But the Caesars weren't ordinary Romans, even if they lived like them. They belonged to the patrician class, the old aristocratic families who claimed their ancestors had founded Rome itself. The Iuli traced their bloodline back over 400 years to the legendary Prince Aeneas, who had escaped from burning Troy and sailed to Italy. Through Aeneas, they claimed descent from the goddess Venus herself. Of course, nobody really believed these old stories. But in Rome, family legends mattered. They gave you the right to wear certain clothes, hold certain offices, and look down on families whose ancestors had been farmers or merchants. The Caesars might live in a middle-class neighbourhood, but they carried themselves like royalty. Caesar's father was also named Gaius Julius Caesar. He was a decent man who followed the traditional path of Roman politics without making much of a mark. He served as praetor, a kind of senior judge, and governed a province in Asia for a few years. Nothing spectacular, nothing that would make historians remember his name. But Caesar's mother was different. Aurelia Cotta came from a family that knew how to survive and thrive in Roman politics. She was smart, tough, and ambitious in the way Roman women had to be. Quietly, behind the scenes, but effectively. Roman law gave women almost no official power, but smart women found ways around that. Aurelia took charge of her son's education from the beginning. She hired the best tutors money could buy. Marcus Antonius Ganiffo taught Caesar Greek literature and philosophy. From him, Caesar learned to love the poetry of Homer and the speeches of Demosthenes. He memorized entire books of the Iliad and could quote Plato's dialogues word for word. But Aurelia made sure her son learned practical skills too. She taught him to read people's faces, to listen for what they weren't saying, to remember everyone's name and their family connections. In Rome, politics was personal. The man who could make others feel important would go far. Caesar was a beautiful child. Ancient writers all mention this. He had fair skin, dark eyes, and hair that he wore longer than most Roman boys. He was tall for his age and moved with natural grace. More importantly, he had a gift for making people like him. Servants smiled when he walked by. Other children followed him around the neighbourhood. Even serious adults found themselves charmed by his quick wit and easy laugh. The boy also showed signs of unusual intelligence. He learned to read and write faster than his tutors expected. He picked up languages easily. Greek, of course, but also some Gallic and Germanic words from slaves and merchants in the Suburra. He had an incredible memory for faces, names, and stories. But Caesar's childhood wasn't all lessons and games. The boy was growing up in the shadow of civil war. When Caesar was 12, Marius and Sulla began their deadly struggle for power. This wasn't just politics. It was personal for the Caesar family. Marius had married Caesar's Aunt Julia years earlier. That made the great general Caesar's uncle by marriage. When Marius's supporters controlled Rome, the Caesars were connected to power. When Sulla took over, they were marked for destruction. Caesar watched his family navigate these dangerous waters. His father kept quiet and tried to avoid taking sides. His mother burned letters and hid family treasures. Relatives disappeared in the night, fleeing to safe houses or foreign cities. The boy learned that in Rome, today's friend could be tomorrow's executioner. The lesson hit home when Caesar was 15. Sulla had won the civil war and was hunting down Marius's remaining supporters. Someone, probably a jealous neighbour or political rival, put Caesar's name on a list of young men who needed to be watched. The charge was guilt by association. His uncle had been Marius, that was enough. Sulla's men came to the house in the Suburra one morning. They wanted to arrest Caesar and bring him for questioning. Everyone knew what that meant. Few people who went for questioning with Sulla's men ever came home. But Aurelia was ready. She had been preparing for this moment for months. While the soldiers searched the house, Caesar slipped out through a back entrance and disappeared into the maze of Subura's narrow streets. He knew every alley, every shortcut, every hiding place. The neighbourhood that had raised him now protected him. For weeks, Caesar lived like a fugitive in his own city. He slept in different houses each night, moving between safe houses run by family friends. He disguised himself as a slave or a merchant's son. He learned to walk differently, talk differently, to become invisible in plain sight. The experience changed him. The charming, privileged boy who had never known real danger was gone. In his place was someone harder, more careful, more aware of how quickly fortune could change. Caesar learned to trust his instincts, to read danger in a man's eyes, to always have an escape plan ready. Eventually Aurelia managed to get her son pardoned. She called in favours, paid bribes, and convinced influential friends to speak for Caesar. The story goes that when someone suggested Sulla should spare the boy because he was just a child, Sulla replied, "You're fools if you don't see that this boy will one day destroy everything we've built." There are many Mariuses in him. Whether Sulla actually said those words, we'll never know. But the story shows what people thought about Caesar even as a teenager. There was something about him, an intensity, an ambition, a refusal to accept limits, that made older men nervous. Caesar's brush with death taught him something crucial about Roman politics. Laws and traditions were just words. What mattered was power. Who had it, who wanted it, and how far they were willing to go to get it. The boy who had grown up reciting noble speeches about duty and honour now understood that survival came first. Everything else was luxury. But the experience also revealed Caesar's character in other ways. While he was in hiding, he could have fled Rome entirely. Many young men in his position did exactly that, sailing to Greece or Asia to wait out the political storm. Caesar chose to stay. Rome was his city, his destiny. He would rather live as a hunted fugitive in the Subura than as a safe exile anywhere else. When the pardons came through and Caesar could finally come home, he found a city that had changed. Sulla's proscription list had killed thousands of Romans. Entire families had been wiped out. Their property had been confiscated and sold to Sulla's supporters. The old aristocracy had been decimated and replaced by new men who owed everything to the dictator. Caesar adapted to this new reality with remarkable speed. He was polite to Sulla's supporters, careful not to mention his family's connection to Marius, and focused on rebuilding his position. But those who knew him well could see that something had hardened inside the charming teenager. He had learned to hide his thoughts behind a smile, to wait patiently for his moment, and to never forget an injury. The boy who would one day rule the world had received his first real education in power. He had learned that mercy was weakness, that loyalty was temporary, and that in the end only the strong survived. But he had also learned something else, that he was strong enough to survive anything Rome could throw at him. Caesar was 17 years old. His real education was just beginning. Caesar couldn't stay in Rome forever, hiding behind his mother's skirts and his family's connections. At 17, he needed to prove himself as a man. In Rome, that meant one thing: military service. The opportunity came in 81 BC, when Marcus Thermus, the governor of Asia, needed young officers for his campaigns against rebellious cities in what is now Turkey. Caesar's family pulled strings to get him a position on Thermus's staff. It was a chance to learn warfare, make connections, and most importantly get far away from Sulla's watchful eyes. The journey east was Caesar's first real taste of the wider world. He sailed past Greek islands where Homer's heroes had fought and died. He saw the ruins of Troy, the city his family claimed as their ancestral home. He visited Alexandria, where Alexander the Great was buried, and Athens, where Plato had taught philosophy in marble halls. But Caesar wasn't there as a tourist. He was there to learn the business of war. His first campaign was against the city of Mytilene on the island of Lesbos. The city had rebelled against Roman rule and was holding out behind strong walls. Thermus decided to take it by siege, a slow, brutal process that could drag on for months. Caesar threw himself into the work with typical intensity. He studied the city's defences, learned how to build siege engines, and volunteered for the most dangerous assignments. When Thermus needed someone to negotiate with the king of Bithynia for naval support, Caesar volunteered for that too. The mission to Bithynia nearly ruined Caesar's reputation before it started. King Nicomedes was known for his love of beautiful young men, and Caesar was certainly that. When Caesar returned with the promised ships, rumours spread that he had earned them by sharing the king's bed. Roman soldiers started calling him the Queen of Bithynia, a joke that would follow him for the rest of his life. But Caesar had the last laugh at Mytilene. During the final assault on the city walls, a Roman soldier fell wounded in the no-man's land between the siege lines and the enemy fortifications. Enemy archers were shooting at anyone who tried to reach him. Most men would have written off the soldier as a casualty of war. Caesar didn't hesitate. He grabbed a shield, sprinted across the open ground under a hail of arrows, and dragged the wounded man to safety. The entire army watched him do it. When Mytilene finally fell, Thermus awarded Caesar the civic crown, a wreath of oak leaves that was Rome's highest decoration for personal bravery. The civic crown was special. Unlike other military decorations, it could only be awarded to someone who had saved the life of a Roman citizen in battle. Men who won it were heroes for life. They could wear the crown at public festivals, and everyone, even senators, had to stand when they entered a room. Caesar was 19 years old, and he already had a reputation for courage that would open doors throughout his career. But his adventures in the East weren't over. On his way back to Rome in 75 BC, Caesar's ship was attacked by Cilician pirates near the island of Pharmacusa. Piracy was a huge problem in those days. The Mediterranean was full of fast ships crewed by desperate men who made their living robbing merchants and kidnapping wealthy Romans for ransom. What happened next became one of the most famous stories about Caesar's character. The pirates demanded 20 talents of silver for his release, about 600 pounds of silver, enough to buy a large estate. Caesar burst out laughing. 20 talents? For Caesar? He was insulted. He told them he was worth at least 50 talents, and he wouldn't accept anything less. The pirates thought this was hilarious. Here was their prisoner negotiating to increase his own ransom. They agreed to the higher price and sent Caesar's servants to raise the money from friends and family scattered across the Greek islands. While they waited for the ransom, Caesar spent 38 days as the pirates' guest. But he didn't act like a prisoner. He acted like their commander. When they were too noisy while he was trying to sleep, he told them to be quiet, and they obeyed. He wrote poems and speeches and forced them to listen to his recitations. When they didn't applaud enthusiastically enough, he called them barbarians and illiterates. He also made them a promise. Once he was free, he would come back with ships and soldiers. He would hunt them down and crucify every one of them. The pirates thought this was another joke. They laughed and slapped him on the back. Caesar wasn't joking. When the ransom arrived and Caesar was released, he went straight to Miletus, the nearest Roman port. He convinced the governor to lend him ships and men for a punitive expedition. Some say he paid for the fleet himself with borrowed money. Either way, within weeks Caesar was back at Pharmacusa with enough firepower to take on the entire pirate band. The pirates were still there, probably spending Caesar's ransom money on wine and women. They weren't expecting to see their former prisoner again, especially not at the head of a Roman fleet. Caesar captured most of them without a fight. Now came the test of Caesar's character. Roman law said that captured pirates should be sold as slaves or ransomed back to their families. It was more profitable than execution, and it avoided the political complications that came with mass killings. But Caesar had made a promise. He had the pirates crucified along the coast where every ship passing through the area would see them. Crucifixion was Rome's most horrible punishment, reserved for slaves and enemies of the state. It was slow, agonizing, and public, designed to terrorize anyone who might think about challenging Roman authority. However, Caesar did show a kind of mercy. Just before the crosses were raised, he had the pirates' throats cut. They would die quickly instead of hanging in agony for days. It was a small gesture, but it showed something important about Caesar's nature. He could be ruthless when necessary, but he took no pleasure in unnecessary cruelty. The pirate story spread throughout the Roman world. Here was a young man who kept his word, who turned the tables on his captors, who combined audacity with competence in a way that impressed everyone who heard about it. Caesar was becoming famous, but he still needed to build his career in Rome. When he returned to the city in 74 BC, he threw himself into the practice of law. In Rome, a young man proved his intelligence and speaking ability by prosecuting corrupt governors and defending clients in the courts. Caesar was a natural speaker. He had a clear, powerful voice that could fill the largest courtroom. His Greek tutors had taught him the tricks of rhetoric, how to structure an argument, when to pause for effect, how to use gestures and facial expressions to emphasize his points. But Caesar added something uniquely his own, a sense of humor that could make even his enemies smile. His most famous case was his prosecution of Gnaeus Dolabella, a former governor of Macedonia who had looted his province so thoroughly that even by Roman standards it was considered excessive. Caesar's speech against Dolabella was a masterpiece of controlled anger and devastating wit. He described Dolabella's crimes in such vivid detail that the audience could practically see the stolen gold and silver being loaded onto ships bound for Rome. Dolabella was defended by Gaius Aurelius Cotta, one of Rome's most respected orators, and, coincidentally, Caesar's cousin. The trial became a battle between two of the finest legal minds in Rome. Caesar lost. Dolabella had too many powerful friends, but his performance established him as one of the rising stars of the Roman bar. More importantly, Caesar learned how to use words as weapons. A well-crafted speech could destroy a man's reputation, end his career, even drive him into exile. In a city where political success depended on public opinion, the ability to sway crowds with eloquent arguments was as valuable as military skill. Caesar decided he needed more training. In 75 BC, he sailed to Rhodes to study under Apollonius Molon, the most famous rhetoric teacher of his generation. Molon had taught Cicero, and his school was considered the best place in the world to learn the art of public speaking. The journey to Rhodes was interrupted by the pirate adventure, but Caesar eventually made it to the island and spent several months studying with the master. Molon taught him to control his gestures, to modulate his voice for maximum effect, and to structure his arguments so that each point built logically on the last. But Caesar was already developing his own style. Where other orators relied on flowery language and emotional appeals, Caesar preferred clear, direct statements that cut straight to the heart of the matter. His sentences were like his sword strokes, precise, economical, and devastatingly effective. Years later, Cicero, who was not generous with praise for potential rivals, admitted that Caesar was one of the finest speakers he had ever heard. "He speaks," Cicero wrote, "with the same precision that he fights, every word chosen for maximum impact, every pause calculated to devastating effect." By the time Caesar returned to Rome in 73 BC, he was 27 years old and ready to begin his political career in earnest. He had proven his courage in battle, his intelligence in the courts, and his determination in dealing with the pirates. He had travelled throughout the Greek East, learning languages and making connections that would serve him for the rest of his life. But most importantly, he had learned to see himself as something special. The boy who had hidden in the Subura's back alleys was gone. In his place stood a young man who believed he was destined for greatness, who combined physical courage with intellectual brilliance, who could charm friends and terrify enemies with equal skill. Caesar had all the tools he needed to succeed in Roman politics. Now he just needed the opportunity to use them. The republic that had nearly killed him as a teenager was about to discover what it had created. Caesar was ready to play the game of power, and he intended to win. Rome had a ladder for ambitious men. They called it the cursus honorum, the course of offices. Every Roman politician had to climb it step by step, starting at the bottom and working their way up. There were rules about how old you had to be for each position, how long you had to wait between jobs, and what qualifications you needed. Caesar was ready to start climbing. Caesar won election as quaestor in 69 BC when he was 31 years old. The voters liked what they saw, a young man with military experience, legal training, and the kind of natural charisma that made people want to follow him. His assignment was to serve under the governor of Hispania Ulteria, the Roman province in southern Spain. Spain was perfect for Caesar. It was far enough from Rome that he could operate independently, but important enough that success there would be noticed back home. The province was wealthy, silver mines in the mountains, fertile farmland along the rivers, and busy ports that connected Rome with the Atlantic trade routes. But Spain also had problems. The native tribes weren't completely pacified. Bandits raided Roman settlements. The previous governor had been corrupt and lazy, leaving behind a mess of unpaid bills and angry locals. Caesar threw himself into the work with his usual energy. He reorganized the provincial finances, paid the overdue bills, and launched small military campaigns against troublesome tribes. Nothing spectacular, but solid, competent administration that impressed his superiors and made life better for ordinary Romans living in Spain. More importantly, Caesar learned how to command troops in real combat situations. Spain wasn't like his earlier service in Asia, where he had been a junior officer following orders. Now he was making the decisions that determined whether men lived or died. He discovered he had a talent for it. Caesar also made his first fortune in Spain. Roman governors were expected to enrich themselves. It was considered one of the perks of the job, as long as you didn't get too greedy. Caesar was careful to take only what custom allowed, but Spanish silver helped pay off the debts he had accumulated during his early career. When he returned to Rome in 68 BC, Caesar faced a personal crisis that showed another side of his character. His first wife Cornelia died suddenly. She had been the daughter of Cinna, Marius's old ally, and their marriage had been as much about politics as love. But Caesar had genuinely cared for her. At Cornelia's funeral, Caesar did something unprecedented. He gave a public eulogy for his wife. Not unusual in itself, but Roman custom said that only elderly women who had lived long, distinguished lives deserved public funeral speeches. Young women, even from noble families, were supposed to be mourned privately. Caesar ignored the tradition. He stood before the assembled crowd and spoke about Cornelia's intelligence, her loyalty, and her strength during the difficult years when his family was under suspicion. He talked about her as an individual, not just as someone's daughter or wife. The speech was so moving that even his political enemies were impressed. The gesture was calculated, but it was also genuine. Caesar understood that breaking social conventions could be powerful if done for the right reasons. He was showing Rome that he valued the people close to him, that he wasn't just another ambitious politician who saw relationships as tools for advancement. Caesar remarried quickly, politics demanded it. His new wife was Pompeia, granddaughter of Sulla. The marriage connected Caesar to some of Rome's most powerful families, while also showing that he harboured no grudges against his former enemies. It was a smart political move that helped rehabilitate his reputation among conservatives who still remembered his family's connection to Marius. With his personal life settled, Caesar focused on the next step up the ladder, aedile. The aediles were responsible for Rome's public works, maintaining the roads, managing the markets, and most importantly, organising the public games and festivals that kept the Roman people entertained. This was where Caesar made his first real mark on Roman politics. The aedileship was expensive because magistrates were expected to pay for the games out of their own pockets. Most men spent what they had to spend, and no more. Caesar decided to bankrupt himself. The games Caesar sponsored in 65 BC were unlike anything Rome had ever seen. He imported exotic animals from Africa, lions, leopards, elephants, and strange creatures most Romans had only heard about in travellers' tales. He hired the best gladiators money could buy. He staged elaborate theatrical performances with casts of hundreds. The centrepiece was a gladiatorial show featuring 320 pairs of fighters, more than twice the number anyone had presented before. The gladiators wore armour made of real silver that gleamed in the afternoon sun. The crowd went wild. Caesar also restored monuments and temples throughout the city, paying for the work himself. He rebuilt the Comitium, where the popular assemblies met. He renovated the Basilica Julia, adding marble columns and bronze decorations. Everywhere Romans looked, they saw evidence of Caesar's generosity. The spending was so extravagant that the Senate got nervous. They passed a law limiting the number of gladiators any magistrate could present. The law was aimed directly at Caesar, but it came too late. He had already staged his spectacular games, and the Roman people loved him for it. Of course, Caesar didn't actually have the money for all this. He borrowed heavily from moneylenders, putting up his family property as collateral. His mother Aurelia mortgaged her house. Friends and political allies provided loans. By the end of his aedileship, Caesar owed more money than most men would see in a lifetime, but the investment paid off. Caesar's name was on everyone's lips. When he walked through the Forum, crowds gathered to cheer him. Shopkeepers offered him free goods. Children followed him through the streets. He had become Rome's most popular politician almost overnight. The popularity translated into political opportunity. In 63 BC, Caesar ran for one of the most prestigious positions in Roman religion, Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of the state cult. It was a lifetime appointment that came with enormous prestige, a beautiful house near the Forum, and influence over religious law. The election was supposed to be a formality. Caesar was running against two much older, more experienced candidates, Quintus Lutatius Catulus and Publius Servilius Vatia. Both men had been consuls, the highest office in Rome. Both had distinguished military records and impeccable reputations. Caesar was 37 years old and had never held a senior magistracy. But Caesar understood something his opponents didn't. In Rome, popularity mattered more than resumes. He campaigned like a man running for consul, visiting every neighborhood, shaking hands with ordinary citizens, making promises about religious reforms that would benefit common people. On election day, Caesar told his mother he would either come home as Pontifex Maximus or not at all. If he lost, his debts would force him into exile. The vote wasn't even close. Caesar won by such a large margin that his opponents were humiliated. The victory established Caesar as a major player in Roman politics. As Pontifex Maximus, he had a say in the religious calendar, the interpretation of omens, and the approval of new cults. More importantly, the position gave him a platform to influence public opinion on any issue he chose to address. Caesar used his religious authority cleverly. When political opponents tried to use religious technicalities to block legislation he supported, Caesar would rule that the omens were favorable or that the gods approved of the proposed laws. When his enemies wanted to postpone elections or cancel public meetings, Caesar would declare that the religious calendar required them to proceed on schedule. But Caesar's growing prominence also made him enemies. Conservative senators who had tolerated him as a charming young man with expensive tastes now saw him as a threat to their power. They began looking for ways to destroy him before he climbed any higher. The opportunity came in 63 BC with the Catiline conspiracy. Lucius Sergius Catilina was a bankrupt aristocrat who had organized a plot to overthrow the government and cancel all debts. The conspiracy included desperate men from all levels of Roman society, ruined nobles, ambitious young politicians, and unemployed veterans who had been promised land and money. Cicero, who was consul that year, uncovered the plot and exposed it in a series of brilliant speeches that drove Catiline from Rome. But Cicero also tried to implicate Caesar, suggesting that Rome's most popular politician was secretly supporting the conspiracy. The accusation was probably false. Caesar was ambitious, but he wasn't stupid. He had too much to lose by supporting a half-baked plot led by a man like Catiline. But the charge was politically damaging because it seemed plausible. Caesar was known for his debts, his popularity with the masses, and his willingness to break with tradition. Caesar's response showed his political maturity. Instead of angrily denying the charges, he calmly offered to submit to investigation. He opened his financial records to public scrutiny. He gave speeches defending the rule of law and condemning political violence. He positioned himself as a responsible statesman who supported reform through legal channels, not revolution through bloodshed. The strategy worked. When the Senate debated what to do with the captured conspirators, Caesar argued for life imprisonment instead of execution. His speech was so eloquent and reasonable that it swayed many senators who had been leaning toward the death penalty. Even Cicero admitted that Caesar had spoken with wisdom and dignity. In the end, the conspirators were executed anyway. Cato the Younger gave a speech that reversed the Senate's mood. But Caesar had shown that he could hold his own in the most serious political debate of the generation. He was no longer just a popular showman. He was a serious politician with serious ideas. The next step was praetor, the second highest magistracy in Rome. Praetors served as judges in important legal cases and could command armies in minor military campaigns. The position was essential preparation for the consulship, the ultimate goal of every ambitious Roman. Caesar won election as praetor for 62 BC easily. His popularity with the voters was now so great that few men wanted to run against him. But his year in office was marked by a scandal that nearly destroyed his marriage and taught him another important lesson about Roman politics. The scandal involved the festival of Bona Dea, a religious ceremony that was supposed to be attended only by women. The festival was held at the house of the current Pontifex Maximus, which meant Caesar's house. Men were strictly forbidden from participating or even being present during the rituals. But Publius Clodius, a wild young aristocrat with a reputation for sexual adventures, disguised himself as a woman and tried to sneak into the ceremony. He was caught, creating a massive religious and political scandal. Some said he was trying to seduce Caesar's wife Pompeia. Others claimed he was gathering information for Caesar's political enemies. Caesar's response was swift and decisive. He divorced Pompeia immediately, even though there was no evidence she had done anything wrong. When asked why, Caesar gave the answer that became famous throughout the Roman world. Caesar's wife must be above suspicion. The phrase revealed something important about Caesar's understanding of power. In politics, appearances mattered as much as reality. A leader couldn't afford to have his personal life become a source of gossip and speculation. By divorcing Pompeia, Caesar showed that he put his public responsibilities above his private feelings. The Clodius affair also demonstrated Caesar's growing political sophistication. Instead of trying to cover up the scandal or defend his wife, he used it as an opportunity to display his moral authority. He positioned himself as a man who upheld religious tradition and family honor even at personal cost. By the end of his praetorship, Caesar had learned all the lessons he needed for the next phase of his career. He understood how to manage money, how to build popular support, how to navigate religious law, and how to turn personal crises into political opportunities. He had served in every major type of Roman magistracy and excelled in each one. But Caesar also understood that the traditional career path had limits. Men who followed the cursus honorum step by step usually ended up as respected but powerless senior senators, giving speeches that nobody listened to and reminiscing about their brief moments of authority. Caesar wanted more than that. He wanted to change Rome, not just serve it. And he was beginning to understand that real change would require breaking some of the rules he had spent his career learning to follow. The ladder of Roman politics had taken Caesar as high as it could. Now he needed to find a different way to climb. Caesar came back from Spain in 60 BC with a problem. Actually, he had two problems, and they were pulling him in opposite directions. The first problem was good news disguised as bad news. His governorship in Hispania Ulteria had been so successful that the Senate had voted him a triumph, the ultimate honor for a victorious Roman general. A triumph meant parading through Rome with his army, displaying captured treasure and prisoners while the entire city cheered. It was the dream of every Roman commander, but there was a catch. To celebrate a triumph, Caesar had to stay outside Rome's sacred boundary with his troops until the ceremony. Roman law was very clear about this. No general could bring armed soldiers into the city except during an official triumph. That's where the second problem came in. Caesar wanted to run for consul, the highest office in Rome. But candidates had to register in person, inside the city, by a specific deadline. If Caesar stayed outside Rome waiting for his triumph, he'd miss the deadline. If he entered the city to register, he'd have to dismiss his troops and forfeit his triumph. For most Romans, this wouldn't have been a choice at all. The consulship was a one-year job. A triumph was eternal glory. But Caesar saw things differently. He was 40 years old, and he understood that real power in Rome was shifting away from traditional magistrates toward men who controlled armies and provinces. A triumph would make him famous for a few days. The consulship could make him powerful for life. So Caesar made a decision that shocked the Roman establishment. He dismissed his troops, entered the city, and registered as a candidate for consul. He gave up his triumph to chase something bigger, but Caesar had learned enough about Roman politics to know he couldn't win the consulship alone. The conservative senators who controlled the system would never let an ambitious populace like him reach the highest office. He needed allies, powerful allies. That's when Caesar made the deal that changed history. The meeting took place in secret, probably at someone's villa outside Rome. 3 men sat down to divide the Roman world among themselves. Historians would later call it the first triumvirate, but the men involved just thought of it as good business. The first man was Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, Pompey the Great. At 55, Pompey was the most successful general of his generation. He had conquered pirates, defeated foreign kings, and expanded Rome's borders from Spain to Syria. His victories had made him incredibly wealthy and popular with both soldiers and civilians. But Pompey had a problem. He needed the Senate to approve land grants for his veterans and ratify the political arrangements he had made in the eastern provinces. The senators were dragging their feet, partly from jealousy and partly from fear of Pompey's growing power. 2 years of negotiations had gotten nowhere. The second man was Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest person in Rome. Crassus owned silver mines, vast estates, and hundreds of businesses throughout the Mediterranean. He had his own private fire brigade that he used to buy burning buildings at bargain prices. Some said he was worth 200 million sestertii, enough money to fund entire armies. But Crassus wanted more than wealth. He wanted military glory to match Pompey's achievements. He also needed political support for tax reforms that would benefit his business interests. Like Pompey, he was frustrated with the Senate's resistance to his proposals. The third man was Caesar. He was younger than the others, less wealthy, and had no major military victories to his credit. But he had something they needed: political skill and popular support. Caesar understood how to work the Roman system from the inside. He knew which senators could be bought, which could be intimidated, and which had to be outmaneuvered. The deal they struck was elegant in its simplicity. Pompey and Crassus would use their money and influence to get Caesar elected consul. In return, Caesar would use his year in office to push through legislation that benefited all 3 men. Pompey would get his land grants and eastern settlements approved. Crassus would get favourable tax policies. Caesar would get a major provincial command that would give him the chance to win military glory and wealth. To seal the alliance, they arranged a marriage. Pompey, who was recently widowed, would marry Caesar's daughter Julia. She was 23, beautiful, and intelligent. Pompey was 55 and had been married 4 times before. But the marriage wasn't just political calculation. Pompey genuinely fell in love with his young bride and she with him. The triumvirate was supposed to be secret, but in Rome, nothing stayed secret for long. People noticed that Caesar's campaign suddenly had unlimited funding. They saw Pompey and Crassus appearing at Caesar's rallies. They heard rumours about private meetings and backroom deals. Caesar's opponents tried to stop him by running the most respected man they could find, Marcus Bibulus, a conservative senator with an impeccable reputation and strong support from traditional families. The election campaign became a battle between the old Rome and the new. Caesar won easily. His combination of popular appeal, financial backing, and organizational skill was too much for Bibulus to overcome. But the conservatives managed to get Bibulus elected as Caesar's colleague. Roman tradition required 2 consuls to serve together as a check on each other's power. They thought Bibulus would be able to restrain Caesar. They were wrong. Caesar's consulship in 59 BC was unlike anything Rome had ever seen. He treated his colleague not as an equal partner, but as an obstacle to be removed. When Bibulus tried to veto Caesar's legislation, Caesar had his bodyguards physically remove him from the forum. When Bibulus attempted to speak against Caesar's proposals, the crowd shouted him down. The most humiliating incident happened during a public meeting about Pompey's land bill. Bibulus stood up to oppose the legislation, following proper constitutional procedure. Caesar's supporters grabbed him, broke his ceremonial rods of office, and dumped a basket of manure over his head. Bibulus retreated to his house and didn't appear in public for the rest of the year. Romans started joking that it was the consulship of Julius and Caesar, instead of the consulship of Caesar and Bibulus. The joke was funny, but it also revealed something troubling. The Roman constitution depended on cooperation between magistrates. When one consul could completely dominate his colleague, the system broke down. Caesar used his unchecked power to push through the triumvirate's agenda with ruthless efficiency. Pompey's veterans got their land grants, his eastern arrangements were ratified. Crassus got his tax reforms. Caesar got a 5-year command in Gaul with 4 legions and the promise of more if needed. But Caesar also passed legislation that went beyond the original deal. He published the Senate's daily proceedings, making their debates public for the first time. He distributed free grain to Rome's poor. He forced wealthy citizens to rent out 1/3 of their apartments to families with children, addressing the city's housing shortage. These reforms were popular with ordinary Romans, but terrified the established elite. Caesar wasn't just pushing through his allies' pet projects. He was fundamentally changing how Rome worked, shifting power away from the Senate and toward popular assemblies and individual magistrates. The conservatives tried to fight back through the courts. They announced that they would prosecute Caesar for illegal acts committed during his consulship, the moment his term ended and he lost his immunity from prosecution. The threat was real. Roman politics was full of men who had been destroyed by politically motivated trials. But Caesar was ready for this move. His 5-year command in Gaul would give him immunity from prosecution as long as he held the position, and 5 years would be plenty of time to win the military victories and accumulate the wealth he needed to protect himself permanently. The triumvirate had given Caesar what he needed most: time and opportunity. Now he had to deliver on his part of the bargain by making the alliance profitable for all 3 partners. But the secret deal had also changed something fundamental about Roman politics. For centuries, the Republic had functioned through open debate, legal procedures, and constitutional checks and balances. Now 3 men were making decisions in private and using their combined power to force those decisions on everyone else. Other senators began forming their own alliances to resist the triumvirate. Cato the Younger emerged as the leader of the opposition, arguing that Caesar and his partners were destroying the Republic's traditions. Cicero, initially neutral, gradually moved toward the conservative camp as he realized how much power the 3 men had accumulated. The city became polarized in a way it hadn't been since the civil wars of Marius and Sulla. You were either with the triumvirate or against it. There was no middle ground. Caesar understood that the alliance would only last as long as it benefited all 3 partners. Pompey and Crassus had been rivals for decades before joining forces with him. Their cooperation was based on mutual advantage, not friendship. If Caesar failed to deliver military victories and provincial wealth, the partnership would collapse. More importantly, Caesar realized that the triumvirate was just a stepping stone to something bigger. Pompey and Crassus were thinking about their immediate political needs. Caesar was thinking about the future of Rome itself. The Republic's traditional institutions were clearly failing. The Senate couldn't govern an empire that stretched from Britain to Mesopotamia. The popular assemblies were too easily manipulated by demagogues and mob violence. The consulship changed hands too frequently to provide consistent leadership. Rome needed something new. Not necessarily a king. That word still made Romans nervous. But some form of permanent, centralized authority that could make quick decisions and enforce them throughout the empire. Caesar didn't share these thoughts with his partners. Pompey was genuinely committed to republican traditions, even as he bent them to serve his purposes. Crassus cared more about profit than politics. Neither man would have supported Caesar's more radical ideas about Rome's future, but as Caesar prepared to leave for Gaul in 58 BC, he was already thinking beyond his 5-year command. The triumvirate had taught him that Rome could be controlled by a small group of determined men with the right combination of resources and ruthlessness. The next step was to prove that it could be controlled by one man with enough of both. Caesar was about to get his chance. Gaul was waiting, a land of fierce tribes, vast forests, and unlimited opportunities for a Roman general ambitious enough to seize them. The boy who had hidden in the Subura's back alleys was gone. The young man who had charmed pirates and prosecuted governors was gone. In their place stood something new, a politician who understood that the old rules no longer applied and who was ready to write new ones. The triumvirate had given Caesar his opening. Now he had to prove he was worthy of it. Caesar arrived in Gaul in 58 BC with 4 legions and a reputation to build. He was 42 years old, and this was his chance to prove he belonged in the same league as Pompey and the other great generals of his time. But first, he had to figure out what exactly he was supposed to conquer. Gaul wasn't a country in the way we think of countries today. It was a patchwork of tribes, each with their own kings, customs, and territories. Some tribes were allies of Rome, others were enemies. Most were somewhere in between, switching sides whenever it suited their interests. The Romans divided Gaul into 3 parts. Gallia Cisalpina, Gaul on this side of the Alps, was already a Roman province covering what we now call northern Italy. Gallia Narbonensis was a narrow strip of Mediterranean coastline that gave Rome control of the land route to Spain. Everything else, the vast forests and plains stretching from the Rhine to the Atlantic, was free Gaul, unconquered and largely unknown. Caesar's official job was to govern the Roman provinces and protect them from barbarian raids. It was supposed to be a quiet assignment that would let him enrich himself through the usual provincial corruption while staying out of trouble back in Rome. But Caesar had bigger plans. He needed military victories to match his political ambitions. More importantly, he needed the kind of wealth that only conquest could provide. Gaul was rich. Gold mines in the mountains, fertile farmland along the rivers, and hundreds of thousands of potential slaves. All it needed was the right excuse for a Roman invasion. The excuse came from an unexpected source. The Helvetii, a Celtic tribe living in what is now Switzerland. The Helvetii had decided their mountain homeland was too small and too poor. They wanted to migrate west to the Atlantic coast, where the land was more fertile and the climate was milder. This kind of mass migration wasn't unusual in ancient Europe. Entire tribes would pack up their belongings, burn their villages to prevent anyone from turning back, and march hundreds of miles to find new homes. The Helvetii planned to take their entire population, men, women, children, elderly, livestock, everything, on a journey across Gaul to the Atlantic. The problem was their route. To reach the coast, the Helvetii would have to march through Roman territory in Gallia Narbonensis. They sent ambassadors to Caesar asking for permission to pass through peacefully. They promised to stay on the roads, pay for any supplies they needed, and cause no trouble for Roman citizens. Caesar said no. His refusal wasn't based on military necessity or legal precedent. The Helvetii weren't threatening Roman territory. They just wanted to pass through it. But Caesar understood that a mass migration of armed barbarians would create chaos throughout Gaul. Other tribes would either try to stop the Helvetii or join them. Either way, there would be fighting, and fighting meant opportunities for a Roman general looking to make his reputation. When the Helvetii tried to force their way through Roman territory, Caesar was ready for them. He had spent months preparing for this moment, building fortifications along the Rhone River and gathering intelligence about Helvetii strengths and weaknesses. The first major battle took place at Bibracte, a hilltop fortress belonging to the Aedui, one of Rome's Gallic allies. The Helvetii had been marching for weeks, their long column of wagons and families stretched out for miles. They were tired, disorganized, and vulnerable. Caesar attacked at dawn with his 4 legions arranged in the classic Roman formation. The Hastatian Principes, the younger, more aggressive soldiers, formed the front lines. The triarii, the veterans, waited in reserve. Each man carried a rectangular shield, a short sword, and 2 javelins designed to punch through enemy armour. The Helvetii fought bravely, but they were no match for Roman discipline and training. Their warriors were individually fierce, but they had no experience fighting as coordinated units. When the Roman javelins struck their shields, the iron points bent and made the shields too heavy to use effectively. When the Romans charged with their swords, the Helvetii line broke and scattered. The battle was a massacre. Roman historians claimed that 200,000 Helvetii had started the migration, and only 110,000 survived to surrender after the battle. The numbers were probably exaggerated. Roman generals always inflated their casualty figures, but there's no doubt that Caesar had won a crushing victory. More importantly, Caesar had learned something crucial about Gallic warfare. The tribes were brave and numerous, but they lacked the organization and equipment to stand up to Roman legions in open battle. If he could force them to fight on his terms, he could beat any combination of enemies. But Caesar also learned that conquering Gaul would require more than just winning battles. The tribes had complex relationships with each other. Ancient alliances, blood feuds, trading partnerships, marriage connections. A smart Roman general could use these relationships to divide his enemies and multiply his allies. The opportunity came sooner than expected. While Caesar was still dealing with Helvetii prisoners and captured treasure, messengers arrived from the Sequani, another Gallic tribe. They had a problem that only Rome could solve. The Sequani had been fighting a long war with their neighbours, the Aedui. Desperate for allies, they had invited a Germanic king named Ariovistus to cross the Rhine with his warriors and help them win. Ariovistus had indeed helped the Sequani defeat the Aedui, but now he refused to go home. Instead, he was bringing more Germanic tribes across the Rhine and claiming Gallic territory for himself. The Sequani realized they had made a terrible mistake. They had invited wolves into their house to chase away dogs, and now the wolves were eating everything. But Ariovistus was too powerful for any single Gallic tribe to defeat. Only Rome had the strength to drive him back across the Rhine. Caesar was delighted by this request. It gave him exactly what he needed, a legitimate reason to expand Roman operations beyond the original Helvetii campaign. He could present himself as the protector of Rome's Gallic allies against Germanic invasion. But Ariovistus wasn't going to be as easy to defeat as the migrating Helvetii. He was an experienced war leader who commanded disciplined Germanic warriors. More importantly, he had been recognized by the Roman Senate as a friend and ally of the Roman people just a few years earlier. Attacking him would require careful political justification. Caesar handled the politics brilliantly. He called a meeting of Gallic tribal leaders and let them make the case against Ariovistus. They described Germanic raids, forced relocations, and demands for tribute that were bleeding Gaul white. They painted Ariovistus as a threat not just to individual tribes but to the entire Gallic way of life. Then Caesar made his move. He sent ambassadors to Ariovistus demanding that he stop bringing new Germanic settlers across the Rhine and return the hostages he had taken from Gallic tribes. The demands were deliberately unreasonable. Caesar knew Ariovistus would reject them, but they established the legal pretext for war. Ariovistus's response was exactly what Caesar had hoped for. The Germanic king said he had conquered his territory fairly and would do whatever he wanted with it. He pointed out that Rome had no legal authority in Free Gaul. If Caesar didn't like Germanic expansion, he was welcome to try stopping it. The challenge was perfect. Caesar now had his casus belli, his justification for war. But he also had a problem. His own soldiers were terrified of fighting Germans. Germanic warriors had a fearsome reputation throughout the ancient world. They were supposed to be giants who painted themselves blue and fought naked in winter. Roman mothers scared their children with stories about Germanic cannibals who ate their enemies' hearts to gain their courage. Most of Caesar's legionaries had never seen a German, but they had heard all the stories. When word spread through the camps that they were marching to fight Ariovistus, discipline began to break down. Some soldiers wrote their wills, others claimed to be sick, a few officers requested transfers back to Rome. Caesar realized he was facing his first real test as a commander. Military leadership wasn't just about tactics and strategy. It was about psychology, understanding what motivated men to fight and die for causes they didn't fully understand. He called his officers together and gave them a speech that became famous throughout the Roman army. He didn't try to minimize the dangers they would face. Instead, he reminded them who they were and what they represented. "We are Romans," Caesar told them. "Our fathers conquered the Cimbri and the Teutones when they invaded Italy. Our grandfathers defeated Hannibal when he brought elephants across the Alps. Are we going to be afraid of barbarians who don't even know how to build proper roads?" But Caesar also made the challenge personal. He said that if his legions were too frightened to follow him, he would march against Ariovistus with just the 10th Legion, his most experienced unit. The other legions could stay behind and explain to Rome why they had abandoned their general. The speech worked perfectly. No Roman soldier wanted to be called a coward, especially not in front of his comrades. The officers who had been requesting transfers now volunteered for the most dangerous assignments. The men who had been writing their wills started sharpening their swords instead. Caesar marched north to find Ariovistus with 6 legions. He had recruited 2 more units from Gallia Cisalpina. The Germanic king was waiting for him with an army that ancient sources claimed was 120,000 strong. The numbers were probably exaggerated, but there's no doubt that Ariovistus commanded a formidable force. The 2 armies maneuvered around each other for weeks, each commander looking for the perfect opportunity to attack. Ariovistus tried to cut Caesar's supply lines. Caesar tried to force a battle on ground that favoured Roman tactics. It was a chess match played with human pieces, where a single mistake could mean death for thousands of men. The decisive battle finally came when Ariovistus attacked Caesar's camp at dawn, hoping to catch the Romans before they could form their battle lines. But Caesar had been expecting something like this. His men were already armed and ready. The fighting was savage. Germanic warriors were individually stronger and fiercer than Roman soldiers, but they had no answer to Roman discipline and coordination. When their initial charge failed to break the Roman lines, they began to lose heart. When Caesar committed his reserves at the crucial moment, the Germanic line collapsed entirely. Ariovistus himself barely escaped across the Rhine. Most of his army was killed or captured. The survivors fled back to Germania, spreading word that the Romans were not to be trifled with. Caesar had won his second major victory in less than a year. More importantly, he had established Roman dominance over a huge area of Gaul, without technically conquering any new territory. He was still operating within his legal mandate as governor of the existing Roman provinces, but everyone understood that something fundamental had changed. Caesar wasn't just defending Roman territory anymore, he was actively reshaping the balance of power throughout Gaul. Tribes that had been independent for centuries now looked to Rome for protection. Germanic kings who'd been planning their own invasions decided to stay on their side of the Rhine. The campaigns against the Helvetii and Ariovistus had taught Caesar everything he needed to know about Gallic warfare. The tribes were brave but disorganized. They could be turned against each other through clever diplomacy. Most importantly, they could be defeated in detail if Caesar could prevent them from uniting against Rome. Caesar spent the winter of 58 to 57 BC planning his next moves. He had proven that Roman legions could defeat any Gallic army in open battle. Now he needed to prove that Rome could control Gaul permanently. The opportunity would come from the north, where the Belgae, the fiercest of all the Gallic tribes, were watching Caesar's victories with growing alarm. They understood that if Caesar wasn't stopped soon, no tribe in Gaul would be safe from Roman conquest. The Belgae were preparing for war, and Caesar was ready for them. By 52 BC, Caesar had been fighting in Gaul for 6 years. He had defeated tribe after tribe, built Roman forts from the Atlantic to the Rhine, and sent so much gold back to Rome that it changed the price of the metal throughout the Mediterranean. Most Romans thought the conquest was finished. They were wrong. The Gauls had been watching Caesar's methods, learning from their defeats, and quietly preparing for one final throw of the dice. What they needed was a leader who could unite the fractious tribes under a single banner, someone young enough to inspire hope but experienced enough to command respect, someone who understood Roman tactics well enough to counter them. They found him in Vercingetorix, a young chieftain of the Arverni tribe. Vercingetorix wasn't what you'd expect from a barbarian war leader. He was in his early 30s, educated and politically sophisticated. His father had been executed by his own tribe for trying to make himself king, which meant Vercingetorix understood both the possibilities and the dangers of unified leadership. More importantly, he had studied Caesar's campaigns carefully. He knew that the Gauls couldn't beat Roman legions in open battle. Too many tribes had tried and failed. But he also knew that Caesar's army had weaknesses. The Romans depended on supply lines that stretched hundreds of miles. They needed to capture enemy strongholds to control territory, and they had never faced a coordinated uprising involving dozens of tribes at once. The revolt began in the winter of 53 to 52 BC, when most of Caesar's legions were scattered in winter quarters across Gaul. The signal was the massacre of Roman merchants and settlers in the town of Cenabum. Within days, the news had spread throughout Free Gaul. The war everyone had been expecting had finally begun. Caesar was in northern Italy when he heard about Cenabum. His first instinct was to rush back to Gaul with whatever troops he could gather. But Vercingetorix had anticipated this move. Arverni warriors were already blocking the mountain passes, making it impossible for Caesar to reach his scattered legions directly. So Caesar did something unexpected. Instead of trying to fight his way through the mountains, he took a small force of cavalry and rode south through Roman territory, then west through the province, and finally north into Arverni territory itself. He was deliberately putting himself in the heart of enemy country with just a few hundred men. The move was brilliant psychology. Vercingetorix had been telling his followers that Caesar was trapped in Italy, unable to help his isolated legions. Suddenly Caesar appeared in Arverni territory, burning villages and threatening the rebels' home base. Vercingetorix had to pull his warriors back from the mountain passes to protect his own people. This gave Caesar the opening he needed. While Vercingetorix was chasing him through Arverni territory, Caesar slipped away and rejoined his legions in the north. The Gallic leader had been outmaneuvered before the real fighting even began, but Vercingetorix learned from the mistake. When the armies finally faced each other at Gergovia, the Arverni stronghold, he didn't try to match Roman tactics. Instead, he used the kind of guerrilla warfare that had served Celtic warriors for centuries. The Gauls avoided pitched battles, attacking Roman supply convoys and isolated detachments instead. They burned their own crops to deny food to Caesar's army. They retreated to hilltop fortresses that were almost impossible to assault. When Caesar tried to besiege these strongholds, Gallic cavalry would appear from nowhere to harass his siege lines. The strategy was working. Caesar's army was running short of supplies. His men were exhausted from constant marching and fighting. Worse, some of Rome's Gallic allies were beginning to switch sides, convinced that Vercingetorix might actually win. At Gergovia, Caesar made his first serious mistake of the Gallic Wars. Frustrated by weeks of unsuccessful siege operations, he ordered a direct assault on the fortress walls. The attack was supposed to be a limited operation, just enough to capture an outer wall and improve the Roman position. But once the assault began, Caesar lost control of it. His soldiers, eager for a decisive victory, pushed deeper into the fortress than their orders allowed. Gallic defenders rallied and counterattacked. What should have been a controlled operation turned into a bloody disaster. The Romans were driven back with heavy losses, nearly 700 men killed, including 46 centurions. It was Caesar's first major defeat in Gaul, and word of it spread throughout the country like wildfire. Tribes that had been neutral now joined the revolt. Even some of Caesar's most reliable allies began to waver. Vercingetorix had proven that Caesar could be beaten. More importantly, he had shown other Gallic leaders that unified resistance could succeed where individual tribal efforts had failed. The revolt that had started with a few dozen tribes now included virtually every people in Free Gaul. Caesar realized he was facing the greatest crisis of his career. His army was trapped deep in enemy territory, surrounded by hostile tribes and running out of food. His political enemies in Rome would be delighted if he were killed or captured in some barbarian forest. The triumvirate that had launched his career was falling apart. Crassus was dead, killed fighting the Parthians, and Pompey was drifting toward the conservative faction. But Caesar had learned something important about himself during 8 years of Gallic warfare. The more desperate his situation became, the clearer his thinking became. Instead of panicking or retreating, he began planning the campaign that would either destroy Vercingetorix or destroy himself. The key was choosing the right battlefield. Caesar couldn't afford another siege like Gergovia, where the Gauls could use their superior knowledge of local terrain to offset Roman advantages in equipment and training. He needed to force Vercingetorix to fight on Caesar's terms, in a place where Roman engineering and discipline would matter more than Gallic mobility and local support. The opportunity came when Vercingetorix decided to make his final stand at Alesia, a hilltop fortress in the territory of the Mandubii tribe. Alesia was perfectly positioned for defence. It sat on a high plateau surrounded by deep valleys, with steep cliffs on 3 sides and only one narrow approach that attackers would have to use. Vercingetorix probably chose Alesia because he thought it was impregnable. No Roman army had ever successfully besieged such a strong position. The fortress could hold his entire army plus thousands of civilian refugees. There were wells inside the walls so the defenders wouldn't lack water, and Gallic relief armies could attack any Roman siege force from the rear. But Caesar saw Alesia differently. Yes, it was a strong position, but it was also a trap. Once Vercingetorix committed his army to defending the fortress, he couldn't retreat without abandoning his followers to Roman vengeance. And Caesar had something no previous Roman general had possessed: 8 years of experience building fortifications in Gallic terrain. What Caesar built at Alesia was the most ambitious engineering project in military history. He surrounded the entire fortress with a wall of circumvallation, a ring of fortifications facing inward toward the city. The wall was 11 miles long, studded with towers and gates, and protected by ditches, stakes, and concealed traps. But Caesar didn't stop there. He knew that Gallic relief armies would eventually come to break the siege. So he built a second wall, a wall of contravallation facing outward. Now his army was protected by 2 complete rings of fortifications, one facing the besieged city and one facing the countryside. The Romans were besieging Alesia while simultaneously preparing to be besieged themselves. It was a double siege unlike anything the ancient world had ever seen. The engineering challenges were enormous. Caesar's men had to dig ditches 12 feet deep and 15 feet wide. They had to cut down entire forests to build palisades and towers. They had to create a water supply system that could serve 70,000 Roman soldiers, plus their horses and pack animals. All of this while under constant attack from Gallic sorties and harassment raids. But the psychological challenges were even greater. Caesar's soldiers were working themselves to exhaustion building fortifications, while their enemies sat safely behind stone walls, well-fed and rested. The Romans were running short of food. Their supply lines were constantly under attack, and foraging parties often didn't come back. Vercingetorix, watching from the walls of Alesia, must have thought Caesar had made a fatal mistake. The Roman general had trapped his own army in an impossible position. When the Gallic relief armies arrived, Caesar would be caught between the hammer of Alesia and the anvil of the relieving force. The relief army that finally appeared was the largest force ever assembled in Gaul. Ancient sources claim it included 250,000 warriors from 60 different tribes. The number was probably exaggerated, but there's no doubt that virtually every fighting man in Free Gaul had come to Alesia to break the siege. What followed was 3 days of the most intense fighting Caesar had ever experienced. The Gauls attacked simultaneously from inside and outside the Roman fortifications. Caesar's men had to defend 2 complete perimeters, while being outnumbered by at least 3 to 1. On the first day, the relief army tested the outer Roman walls while Vercingetorix's men probed the inner fortifications. The attacks were coordinated. When one assault reached its climax, the other would begin, preventing Caesar from shifting his reserves to meet each threat. On the second day, the Gauls tried a night attack, hoping to catch the Romans off guard in the darkness. But Caesar had anticipated this move. His fortifications included alarm systems, tripwires connected to bells that would alert sentries to approaching enemies. The night attack was detected and repulsed with heavy Gallic casualties. The third day brought the supreme test. A Gallic force had discovered a weak point in Caesar's outer wall where the terrain made construction difficult. They launched a massive assault on this position while simultaneously attacking from the other directions. For a few hours it looked like the Gauls might succeed. Roman reserves rushed from crisis to crisis as their lines bent under the pressure. Caesar himself grabbed a shield and sword and led counterattacks at the most threatened points. His scarlet cloak made him an obvious target, but it also inspired his men to fight harder. The turning point came when Caesar made a desperate gamble. He took his cavalry, the only mobile reserve he had left, and led them outside his own fortifications to attack the main Gallic relief army from the rear. It was an all-or-nothing move. If the cavalry charge failed, Caesar's army would be destroyed. The charge succeeded brilliantly. The Gallic relief army, already exhausted from days of fighting, couldn't handle being attacked from an unexpected direction. Their lines broke and scattered. Thousands of warriors fled the battlefield, spreading panic throughout the remaining Gallic forces. Vercingetorix, watching from the walls of Alesia, saw his last hope disappear. The relief army was gone. His own men were starving. They had been eating leather and bark for weeks. Further resistance would only mean more suffering for the civilians trapped in the fortress. So Vercingetorix did something that shocked both Romans and Gauls. He called an assembly of his war chiefs and announced that he was surrendering himself to Caesar. Not his army, just himself. He would take responsibility for the revolt and face whatever punishment Caesar chose to impose. The surrender scene became legendary. Vercingetorix put on his finest armour and weapons, mounted his best horse, and rode slowly out of Alesia toward the Roman camp. He circled Caesar's platform 3 times in the traditional Celtic gesture of submission, then threw his weapons at Caesar's feet and knelt in silence. Caesar accepted the surrender with typical Roman dignity. He praised Vercingetorix's courage and leadership. He promised that the Gallic civilians in Alesia would be spared and allowed to return to their homes. But Vercingetorix himself would be taken to Rome as a prisoner, to be displayed in Caesar's eventual triumph. The Great Gallic Revolt was over. Vercingetorix would spend the next 6 years in a Roman prison, waiting for Caesar's triumph. When that ceremony finally took place in 46 BC, the Gallic leader would be ritually strangled in the traditional Roman manner, his death marking the official end of Gallic independence. But in a strange way, Vercingetorix had achieved something important even in defeat. He had forced Caesar to reveal the full extent of his military genius. The double siege of Alesia became the textbook example of Roman engineering and tactical flexibility. Military academies would study it for centuries. More importantly, Vercingetorix had united the Gallic tribes in a way no leader had ever managed before. The revolt failed, but it created a shared sense of Gallic identity that would survive Roman rule. 1,500 years later, when French kings needed a national hero to inspire resistance against foreign invaders, they would remember Vercingetorix, the young chieftain who had almost driven Caesar from Gaul. Caesar had won his greatest victory, but he had also faced his greatest test. The man who emerged from Alesia was different from the politician who had crossed the Rubicon into Gaul 8 years earlier. He had proven he could command armies, build empires, and defeat enemies who seemed unbeatable. Now he was ready to use those skills in an even more dangerous arena, the civil war that was waiting for him back in Rome. With most of Gaul under Roman control, Caesar started looking beyond the continent toward an island that had fascinated Romans for generations. Britain lay just 20 miles across the Channel from the Gallic coast, but it might as well have been on the moon for all Romans knew about it. The island was shrouded in mystery and legend. Greek geographers claimed it was inhabited by painted warriors who fought from horse-drawn chariots. Roman merchants brought back stories of tin mines, pearl fisheries, and druids who practiced human sacrifice in sacred groves. Some said the Britons were giants. Others claimed they were skilled metalworkers who forged weapons sharper than any Roman sword. But what really interested Caesar wasn't British tin or pearls. It was the fact that no Roman had ever set foot on the island as a conqueror. Pompey had conquered the east. Crassus had been trying to conquer Parthia when he died. If Caesar could add Britain to the empire, he would have accomplished something neither of his former partners had managed, conquering a completely unknown land. There were practical reasons for the expedition too. Many Gallic tribes had relatives and trading partners in Britain. During the recent revolts, British warriors had crossed the Channel to fight alongside their continental cousins. Caesar could argue that invading Britain was necessary to secure Gaul's western flank, but mostly Caesar wanted to do something that would capture Rome's imagination. His Gallic victories were impressive, but they were victories over known enemies in familiar territory. Britain was different. Britain was the edge of the world, the mysterious island beyond the ocean that marked the boundary of human knowledge. Planning the expedition was a nightmare. Caesar had no reliable maps of British coastlines. He didn't know where to land, what kind of resistance to expect, or even whether his ships could handle the treacherous waters of the English Channel. Roman naval technology was designed for the calm Mediterranean, not the rough northern seas with their unpredictable tides and sudden storms. Caesar sent scouts across the Channel in fast Gallic boats, but they came back with contradictory reports. Some said the British coast was lined with cliffs that would make landing impossible. Others described broad beaches perfect for bringing ships ashore. Nobody could agree on the size of British armies or the location of their main settlements. The intelligence gathering was complicated by British countermeasures. The tribes had their own spies in Gaul, and they knew Caesar was planning something. British warbands began concentrating along the coast. Signal fires were prepared to spread news of any Roman landing. The Druids, who served as priests, judges, and military advisors throughout Celtic society, declared that the gods would destroy any Roman fleet that dared to cross the sacred waters. Caesar decided to go anyway. In late August of 55 BC, he assembled a fleet of about 80 ships at the Gallic port of Portus Itius, modern Bologna. The force was relatively small, 2 legions plus auxiliary troops, maybe 12,000 men total. It was large enough to establish a beachhead, but not large enough to conquer the entire island. The crossing itself was an adventure. Roman ships were built for carrying cargo and passengers in calm water, not for amphibious warfare in rough seas. The legionaries, most of whom had never been on a ship before, were seasick before they cleared the harbour. The cavalry horses, loaded onto separate transports, panicked in the heavy swells and had to be restrained with the ropes and blindfolds. Caesar's fleet reached the British coast near modern Dover, but the cliffs there were too steep for landing. British warriors lined the heights, their weapons glinting in the afternoon sun, ready to slaughter any Romans who tried to come ashore. Caesar ordered the fleet to move northeast along the coast, looking for a better landing site. The Britons followed the Roman ships along the shore, their cavalry and chariots keeping pace with the fleet. It was an eerie procession, Roman warships moving slowly through the surf while British warriors shadowed them on land, both sides waiting for the moment when the real fighting would begin. Caesar finally found what he was looking for near modern Deal, a broad, gently sloping beach where his ships could get close to shore, but the water was still too deep for the heavily armoured legionaries to wade through safely. Roman soldiers wore mail shirts, carried large shields, and loaded themselves down with equipment that would drag them to the bottom if they fell into deep water. The landing became one of the most famous scenes in Roman military history. Caesar's ships were stuck in shoulder-deep water, afraid to come closer to shore because of hidden rocks and sandbars. The legionaries stood at the ship's rails, looking at the beach where British chariots wheeled back and forth, their drivers shouting war cries in a language no Roman understood. Nobody wanted to be the first to jump into the surf. It meant abandoning the safety of the ships and wading through deep water, while British warriors threw spears and shot arrows. Even if you made it to the beach alive, you'd be outnumbered and exhausted from fighting the waves and current. Then the standard-bearer of the 10th Legion, Caesar's favourite unit, made a decision that changed everything. He grabbed the Legion's golden eagle, the sacred symbol that represented Rome's power and the soldiers' honour, and jumped into the water. "Leap down, soldiers," he shouted, "unless you want to betray your eagle to the enemy. I, at any rate, shall have done my duty to the Republic and my general." The sight of their sacred standard being carried toward the enemy was more than the legionaries could bear. They started jumping from the ships, splashing through the surf with their shields held high and their swords ready. The water churned white with foam as hundreds of armoured men fought their way toward the beach. The Britons had never seen anything like it. They were used to fighting other Celtic tribes, where battles began with individual champions issuing challenges and boasting about their ancestry. The sight of Roman soldiers advancing in formation through the surf, maintaining their battle lines even in chest-deep water, was something outside their experience. The Roman landing succeeded, but just barely. Caesar's men established a small beachhead and fought off several British counterattacks. But they were stuck on a narrow strip of sand with no cavalry. The horse transports had been scattered by storms, and no reliable way to get supplies from Gaul. The Britons quickly adapted to Roman tactics. They avoided pitched battles, using their superior mobility to harass Roman foraging parties and supply convoys. British chariots were particularly effective. They could charge up to Roman battle lines, throw javelins, and retreat before the legionaries could respond. It was like fighting ghosts who appeared and disappeared at will. Caesar realized he had underestimated both the difficulty of the crossing and the sophistication of British resistance. After 18 days of limited operations, he decided to return to Gaul before autumn storms made the Channel crossing impossible. The first British expedition had been more of a reconnaissance in force than a real invasion, but the expedition had achieved its main purpose. It had captured Rome's imagination. Caesar's dispatches describing the mysterious island and its fierce inhabitants were read aloud in the forum to cheering crowds. Poets wrote verses about Roman eagles flying beyond the edge of the world. Artists created paintings of legionaries battling painted warriors in strange northern landscapes. More importantly, Caesar had learned valuable lessons about British geography, tactics, and politics. The island wasn't the primitive backwater some Romans had imagined. The Britons were skilled metalworkers, accomplished warriors, and sophisticated political thinkers. Conquering them would require a much larger force and better preparation. Caesar spent the winter of 55-54 BC planning a second expedition. This time he would bring 5 legions plus auxiliary troops, about 25,000 men total. He commissioned a new fleet designed specifically for channel crossings, with shallow draft ships that could beach themselves on British shores. Most importantly, he gathered intelligence about British political divisions that Rome could exploit. The second expedition in 54 BC was much more successful. Caesar's larger force established a secure beachhead and pushed inland toward the Thames River. The Britons, led by a king named Cassivellaunus, tried to stop the Roman advance using the same guerrilla tactics that had worked the previous year, but Caesar had learned how to counter British mobility. He used his cavalry more aggressively, forcing the Britons to fight pitched battles where Roman discipline and equipment gave them decisive advantages. When Cassivellaunus tried to attack Caesar's naval base, Roman engineering and artillery drove off the assault with heavy British casualties. The campaign's climax came when Caesar forced a crossing of the Thames River, despite British attempts to block it with underwater stakes and constant harassment from chariots and cavalry. The crossing demonstrated Roman engineering skill and tactical flexibility in a way that impressed even Caesar's enemies. Cassivellaunus eventually sued for peace, offering hostages and tribute in exchange for Roman withdrawal. Caesar accepted the terms, partly because winter was approaching, and partly because news from Gaul suggested new revolts were brewing that required his immediate attention. The British expeditions were strategic successes even though they didn't result in permanent conquest. Caesar had shown that Roman power could reach anywhere, even to mysterious islands beyond the known world. He had gathered intelligence that would prove invaluable when Claudius finally conquered Britain a century later. Most importantly, he had added another chapter to his growing legend. But the expeditions also revealed something important about Caesar's character. He was willing to take enormous risks for relatively small strategic gains, if those gains enhanced his reputation and political position back in Rome. The British expeditions were as much about Caesar's career as they were about Roman expansion. The young man who had once been held prisoner by pirates had become someone who thought nothing of leading armies across unknown seas to fight mysterious enemies in distant lands. Caesar was no longer just conquering territory. He was conquering the impossible itself, pushing the boundaries of what Romans thought could be achieved. When Caesar returned from his second British expedition, he found Gaul on the verge of another major revolt. But he also found something else. Messages from Rome indicating that his partnership with Pompey was falling apart and that powerful enemies were preparing to destroy him the moment his Gallic command ended. The island expeditions had been a glorious adventure. Now Caesar had to prepare for a much more dangerous campaign, the fight for his own political survival. While Caesar was fighting Gauls and exploring Britain, the political alliance that had made his career possible was falling apart back in Rome. The first triumvirate had always been held together more by mutual need than genuine friendship. Now those needs were changing, and the three most powerful men in Rome were becoming enemies. The first crack appeared in 54 BC with a death that nobody expected. Julia, Caesar's daughter and Pompey's wife, died in childbirth along with her baby. She was only 29 years old, beautiful, intelligent, and genuinely beloved by both her father and her husband. Julia's death wasn't just a personal tragedy, it was a political disaster. The marriage had been the strongest bond holding Caesar and Pompey together. Pompey had truly loved his young wife. Friends said he had never been happier than during their 5 years of marriage. Caesar had adored his only daughter and trusted her to keep Pompey loyal to their alliance. Without Julia, the two men had no personal connection. They were just political partners who happened to need each other, for now. Pompey's grief was genuine and deep. He withdrew from public life for months, refusing to attend Senate meetings or social gatherings. When friends suggested he should remarry to maintain his political alliances, he reacted with anger. Nobody could replace Julia, he said. No marriage would ever again be about love rather than politics. But politics in Rome didn't pause for personal grief. The city was becoming increasingly violent as rival gangs fought for control of the streets. Publius Clodius, the same man who had caused the Bonadea scandal years earlier, now led a private army of thugs who terrorized Caesar's enemies. His rival Titus Annius Milo commanded his own gang that fought back with equal brutality. The violence reached its peak in 52 BC when Clodius and Milo met by chance on the Appian Way outside Rome. What started as a roadside argument between their bodyguards escalated into a running battle that left Clodius dead and Rome in chaos. Clodius's supporters carried his body to the Forum and used it as kindling to burn down the Senate House itself. The destruction of the Senate House was symbolic. The Republic's most sacred building, where generations of Roman statesmen had debated the great issues of their time, was reduced to ashes by a mob seeking revenge for a gang leader's death. It showed how far Roman politics had descended into tribalism and violence. The Senate, meeting in a temporary location, made a desperate decision. They appointed Pompey as sole consul, consul sine collega, giving him emergency powers to restore order. It was an unprecedented step that violated centuries of republican tradition, requiring two consuls to serve together as checks on each other's authority. Pompey accepted the appointment and used his new powers effectively. He recruited new legions, cleared the gangs from Rome's streets, and restored a semblance of normal government. But his methods were harsh. Men who had participated in the street fighting were executed or exiled. Political meetings were surrounded by armed soldiers. Rome became peaceful, but it was the peace of a military occupation. More importantly, Pompey's sole consulship changed his relationship with the other triumvirs. He was no longer just one of three partners sharing power. He was the man the Senate had turned to when the Republic faced its greatest crisis. Conservative senators who had once opposed him now saw him as their protector against more radical politicians like Caesar. The change became obvious when Pompey remarried. His new wife was Cornelia, daughter of Quintus Metellus Scipio, one of Caesar's most bitter enemies. The marriage alliance brought Pompey into the heart of the conservative faction that had been fighting Caesar's reforms for years. Caesar tried to maintain the partnership by proposing new arrangements. He suggested that Pompey should marry Caesar's grandniece, while Caesar would marry Pompey's daughter. It was the kind of marriage diplomacy that had created the original triumvirate, but Pompey rejected the proposal. He was done with Caesar's family connections. The third member of the triumvirate was already gone. Marcus Crassus had left for the east in 54 BC, determined to win military glory that would match Caesar's Gallic victories and Pompey's earlier conquests. At 60 years old, Crassus was still the richest man in Rome, but he had never commanded a major campaign against a foreign enemy. Crassus's target was Parthia, the empire that controlled much of what is now Iran and Iraq. The Parthians were Rome's most dangerous eastern neighbours, skilled horsemen who used tactics no Roman general had ever faced. But Crassus was confident that Roman discipline and equipment would overcome barbarian mobility, just as they had in Gaul and everywhere else Romans had fought. He was catastrophically wrong. The Parthian campaign was a disaster from the beginning. Crassus ignored advice from local allies who understood Parthian tactics. He marched his legions across the Mesopotamian desert in summer heat that killed men before they ever saw an enemy. When he finally encountered the main Parthian army near a town called Carrhae, his forces were already weakened by heat, thirst, and poor leadership. The Battle of Carrhae became one of the worst defeats in Roman military history. The Parthians used mounted archers who could shoot accurately while riding at full gallop. They would charge toward the Roman lines, loose clouds of arrows, then wheel away before the legionaries could respond. It was like trying to fight a swarm of wasps. Roman tactics, designed for close-quarters combat against infantry, were useless against an enemy that refused to stand and fight. The legionaries formed their traditional testudo, tortoise formation, with shields locked together for protection. But the Parthian arrows found gaps in the shield wall, and the Romans couldn't advance without breaking their defensive formation. The battle lasted all day under the blazing sun. Roman casualties mounted steadily while the Parthians seemed to have unlimited arrows. When Crassus finally tried to negotiate a truce, he was killed during the parley. Some said murdered, others claimed he died fighting when the negotiations broke down. The survivors of Crassus's army were killed or enslaved. The Parthians captured Roman military standards, including several legionary eagles that would remain in enemy hands for decades. It was the kind of humiliating defeat that shook Roman confidence and made enemies throughout the empire think Rome might be vulnerable after all. News of Carrhae reached Rome in early 53 BC, just as Caesar was dealing with the final stages of Gallic resistance. The death of Crassus meant the triumvirate was officially dead. Only Caesar and Pompey remained, and they were no longer partners. They were rivals circling each other like gladiators, waiting for the right moment to strike. The Senate, emboldened by Pompey's support, began making demands that were clearly aimed at destroying Caesar. They refused to extend his Gallic command beyond its original 5-year term. They insisted he return to Rome as a private citizen if he wanted to run for consul again. Most ominously, they began preparing legal charges that would be filed against him the moment he lost his immunity as a provincial governor. Caesar understood what was happening. His enemies were trying to force him into an impossible choice. He could return to Rome without his armies and face prosecution that would certainly end in exile or death, or he could stay in Gaul with his legions and be declared a public enemy. There was a third option, but it was almost too dangerous to consider. Caesar could march on Rome itself, as Marius and Sulla had done before him. He could use his battle-hardened legions to seize power and remake the Republic according to his own vision. But that would mean civil war. It would mean Roman fighting Roman, brother against brother, in a conflict that could tear the empire apart. Caesar had spent his entire career working within the republican system. Even when he bent its rules to serve his purposes, could he really destroy that system to save himself? The decision was made more difficult by Caesar's genuine affection for Pompey. Despite their political differences, the two men had been partners for years. They had shared power, wealth, and family connections. Caesar's daughter had loved Pompey, and Pompey had made her happy. There had to be some way to avoid a war between them. Caesar tried negotiation first. He sent messages to Rome proposing various compromises. He would give up most of his legions if he could keep just 2 and retain his governorship until he could legally run for consul. He would return to Rome immediately if Pompey would do the same, both men laying down their commands simultaneously. But the conservative senators who now influenced Pompey had no interest in compromise. They had spent years watching Caesar grow more powerful and popular. This was their chance to destroy him permanently. They convinced Pompey that Caesar was bluffing, that he would never actually start a civil war over his own political survival. They were wrong about that, just as they had been wrong about almost everything else concerning Caesar. By late 50 BC, the situation in Rome had become impossible. The consul, Marcus Claudius Marcellus, proposed that Caesar be declared a public enemy if he didn't dismiss his armies by a specific date. When the tribunes Mark Antony and Quintus Cassius, both Caesar's supporters, tried to veto the proposal, they were threatened with violence and forced to flee the city. The flight of the tribunes gave Caesar the legal pretext he needed. In Roman law, threatening the tribunes was equivalent to attacking the Roman people themselves. Caesar could now claim he was marching on Rome not to seize power, but to defend the constitution against men who had violated its most sacred principles. But legal pretexts aside, everyone understood what was really happening. The republic that had ruled the Mediterranean for 5 centuries was about to tear itself apart. The partnership that had once seemed capable of governing the world peacefully had collapsed into personal rivalry and factional hatred. Caesar stood at his winter headquarters in northern Italy, looking south toward Rome. Behind him were 11 battle-hardened legions absolutely loyal to their commander. Ahead lay the Rubicon River, and a choice that would determine not just his own fate but the future of Western civilization. The triumvirate was dead. The Republic was dying, and Caesar was about to decide whether to save it or put it out of its misery. Caesar had been stalling for months, hoping someone in Rome would come to their senses. But by January of 49 BC, it was clear that no compromise was possible. His enemies wanted him destroyed, and they were willing to risk civil war to make it happen. The final ultimatum came through official channels. The Senate, backed by Pompey's authority, gave Caesar a simple choice: dismiss his armies immediately and return to Rome as a private citizen, or be declared an enemy of the Roman people. There would be no extensions, no negotiations, no face-saving alternatives. Caesar's supporters in Rome had already fled. Mark Antony and Quintus Cassius, the tribunes who had tried to protect Caesar's interests, had been forced to leave the city when conservative senators threatened them with violence. They arrived at Caesar's headquarters in Ravenna disguised as slaves, carrying news that the Senate was preparing for war. The situation was clear. Caesar's enemies controlled Rome, the Senate, and the machinery of government. They had Pompey's legions and the loyalty of most provincial governors. They commanded the treasury, the fleet, and the support of Rome's Italian allies. On paper, Caesar was outnumbered and outgunned. But Caesar had advantages his enemies didn't fully understand. His 11 legions weren't just disciplined soldiers, they were veterans who had followed him through 8 years of Gallic warfare. They had shared the dangers of unknown forests and hostile tribes. They had grown rich from Gallic gold and proud of victories that had made them famous throughout the Roman world. More importantly, these men were personally loyal to Caesar in a way that transcended normal military discipline. He knew their names, their families, their individual acts of courage. He had shared their hardships and celebrated their victories. When Caesar's soldiers looked at their general, they didn't see a politician trying to save his career. They saw the commander who had led them to glory and wealth beyond anything they had dreamed possible. Caesar tested this loyalty in the most direct way possible. He called an assembly of the 13th Legion, the unit that had been with him longest and knew him best. Standing before 5,000 battle-hardened veterans, he explained the situation without sugarcoating anything. The Senate wanted to destroy him, Caesar told them. His enemies were willing to start a civil war rather than allow him to return to Rome with honor. If he obeyed their ultimatum, he would be prosecuted on trumped-up charges and either executed or exiled. His officers would face similar fates. The wealth and glory they had earned in Gaul would be confiscated by men who had never left Italy. But if they followed him across the Rubicon, they would be committing treason against the Roman state. They would be making war on their own countrymen. There would be no going back, no forgiveness if they lost. Victory would bring them rewards beyond imagination. Defeat would mean death or slavery for every man in the ranks. Caesar gave his soldiers a choice. Any man who wanted to return to civilian life could leave with full pay and no questions asked. Those who stayed would follow him wherever the campaign led, even if it meant marching on Rome itself. Not a single soldier left. When Caesar finished speaking, the entire legion cheered and demanded to be led against their general's enemies. They had made their choice, and it was the same choice Caesar had made. They would rather die as his soldiers than live as anyone else's citizens. The decision to cross the Rubicon wasn't made in a moment of passion. Caesar spent days considering alternatives, consulting with his officers and calculating the odds of success. He understood exactly what he was doing and what it would cost. Crossing the river with his army would make Caesar a rebel against the Roman state. It would trigger a civil war that could destroy the empire his ancestors had spent centuries building. It would pit Roman against Roman in battles that would leave the Mediterranean world weakened and vulnerable to foreign enemies. But staying north of the Rubicon meant accepting destruction at the hands of men who had violated every principle of justice and fair dealing. Caesar's enemies weren't trying to preserve the Republic. They were trying to use Republican institutions to eliminate a political rival who had become too successful for their comfort. The night of January 10th, 49 BC, Caesar made his final preparations. He dined with friends and officers, discussing literature and philosophy as if nothing unusual was happening. He dictated letters to his secretaries, settling routine administrative matters. He reviewed the next day's march orders with his centurions. But everyone knew this wasn't a normal evening. The tension in the headquarters was thick enough to cut with a sword. Officers spoke in whispers. Soldiers checked their equipment with unusual care. Even the camp followers, the merchants, servants, and hangers-on who travelled with every Roman army, seemed to understand that something momentous was about to happen. Around midnight, Caesar left his headquarters with a small escort of cavalry. He rode through the sleeping camp past sentries who saluted without knowing they were watching history unfold. The winter night was cold and clear, with stars bright enough to navigate by. The Rubicon itself was nothing impressive, just a shallow stream running through the flat countryside of northern Italy. In summer you could probably jump across it. Even in winter the water barely reached a horse's belly. But this little river marked the boundary between Caesar's province and Italy proper. Roman law absolutely forbade any general from crossing it with armed troops. Caesar halted his horse at the water's edge. Behind him the 13th Legion waited in battle formation, their armour and weapons gleaming in the starlight. Ahead lay Italy, Rome, and a future that no one could predict. For a few minutes Caesar sat motionless on his horse, staring at the dark water. This was his last chance to turn back, to find some other solution, to avoid the catastrophe of civil war. Once he crossed this stream, there would be no return to the old life of republican politics and constitutional procedures. Then Caesar spoke the words that would echo through 20 centuries of history. Alea iacta est. The die is cast. He spurred his horse into the water. The Rubicon was so shallow that the crossing took only minutes, but those minutes changed the world. When Caesar's horse stepped onto the southern bank, the Roman Republic effectively died. What emerged from the civil war that followed would be something entirely different, an empire ruled by emperors, not a republic governed by senators. The soldiers of the 13th Legion followed their general across the stream without hesitation. They had made their choice weeks earlier. Now they were simply carrying it out step by step, as they had carried out every other order Caesar had given them. But the crossing itself was just the beginning. Caesar now had to prove that his gamble could succeed. He was marching against the most powerful state in the ancient world with a single legion and a handful of cavalry. Pompey commanded more than twice as many troops, plus the resources of the Roman treasury and the support of most provincial governors. Caesar's first move was typically audacious. Instead of advancing slowly and cautiously, he struck fast at targets his enemies weren't expecting to defend. The town of Ariminum fell without a fight. Its garrison surrendered the moment Caesar's soldiers appeared at the gates. Pisorum opened its doors after a brief siege. Fanum Fortunae welcomed Caesar as a liberator. The speed of Caesar's advance caught his enemies completely off guard. They had expected him to spend weeks gathering reinforcements and preparing for a long campaign. Instead, he was racing down the Italian peninsula with a single legion, capturing towns faster than messengers could carry news of his movements. More importantly, Caesar's clemency policy began working immediately. Instead of executing captured enemies or selling them into slavery, the normal fate of rebels, Caesar pardoned everyone who surrendered and allowed them to return home or join his army as volunteers. Word of this unprecedented mercy spread throughout Italy faster than Caesar's legions could march. The psychological effect was devastating to Caesar's opponents. They had expected to face a desperate rebel leading a barbarian horde bent on looting Italian cities. Instead, they found themselves fighting a Roman general who treated prisoners with honor and civilians with respect. Many Romans who had initially supported Pompey began to wonder whether they were on the right side. Pompey's response revealed how completely Caesar had outmaneuvered him. Instead of rushing north to stop Caesar's advance, Pompey decided to abandon Italy entirely. He would retreat to Greece, gather the eastern legions, and return with overwhelming force to crush the rebellion. The decision was strategically sound but politically disastrous. By leaving Italy, Pompey appeared to be running away from Caesar. Worse, he left Rome itself defenseless. The city that had ruled the Mediterranean for centuries was abandoned by its protectors at the first sign of serious opposition. Caesar reached Rome in March, just 2 months after crossing the Rubicon. The city's gates stood open. The streets were quiet but not hostile. Most Romans seemed more curious than frightened about their new master. Caesar's behavior in Rome was as carefully calculated as his military campaign had been. He didn't enter the city in triumph with his soldiers. Instead, he dismissed his legions outside the sacred boundary and entered as a civilian, wearing a toga instead of military uniform. He made no arrests, seized no property, and issued no proscription lists. The Senate house that had been burned during the Clodius riots was being rebuilt, and Caesar ordered work to continue. He addressed the remaining senators with respect, promising to govern through existing institutions rather than personal decree. But Caesar also made it clear that the old system was finished. He opened the treasury to fund his growing army, overriding the objections of officials who lacked the power to stop him. He passed emergency legislation through popular assemblies, bypassing the Senate entirely when necessary. Most tellingly, Caesar began recruiting new legions from Italian communities that had never provided soldiers for Roman armies. He was expanding the military beyond its traditional social boundaries, creating a force that would be loyal to him personally rather than to republican institutions. The crossing of the Rubicon had been successful beyond Caesar's wildest expectations. In less than 3 months he had gone from rebel general to master of Italy. Pompey was in exile. The Senate was powerless. Rome itself lay at Caesar's feet. But the civil war was far from over. Pompey was gathering armies in Greece and Spain. Republican governors controlled most of the eastern provinces. The treasury Caesar had captured was nearly empty, drained by years of corruption and mismanagement. Caesar had won the first round, but the real test was still ahead. He would have to prove that his revolution could succeed not just in Italy, but throughout the Roman world, and he would have to do it while fighting enemies who commanded more resources, more territory, and more experienced generals than he had ever faced. The die had been cast. Now Caesar had to live with the results. Caesar's march down the Italian peninsula was unlike any military campaign Rome had ever seen. This wasn't conquest. It was more like a political parade with legions. City after city opened their gates without a fight. Governors who had sworn loyalty to Pompey switched sides the moment Caesar's scouts appeared on the horizon. The secret was Caesar's clemency policy. Roman civil wars had always been about revenge and extermination. When Marius and Sulla fought for control of Rome, the winner would publish proscription lists, death sentences for hundreds or thousands of enemies. Houses would be burned, families destroyed, entire bloodlines wiped out to prevent future revenge. Caesar did the opposite. Every captured enemy was given a choice: go home peacefully or join Caesar's army as a volunteer. There were no executions, no confiscations, no punishment beyond the humiliation of defeat. For Romans used to the brutal logic of civil war, it was almost incomprehensible. The policy worked because it was genuine. Caesar wasn't just being calculating, though the political benefits were obvious. He genuinely believed that Romans should stop killing each other over political differences. The Republic had been destroying itself through cycles of revenge and counter-revenge. Caesar wanted to break that cycle. His first major test came at Corfinium, where Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus had gathered about 30 cohorts, roughly 15,000 men, to stop Caesar's advance. Ahenobarbus was one of Caesar's bitterest enemies, a conservative senator who had spent years trying to end Caesar's Gallic command. The siege of Corfinium lasted only a week. Caesar's veterans, experienced in siege warfare from their Gallic campaigns, quickly surrounded the town and began building the earthworks that would starve the defenders into submission. But before the siege lines were even completed, Ahenobarbus's own officers began negotiating surrender. They had heard about Caesar's clemency from other captured Romans. Instead of facing certain death, they could expect pardon and the chance to return to their families. Why die for a cause that was already lost? When Corfinium surrendered, Caesar's handling of the prisoners set the tone for the entire Italian campaign. Ahenobarbus himself, the man who had called Caesar a traitor and demanded his execution, was brought before Caesar in chains, expecting to be killed immediately. Instead, Caesar ordered his chains removed, returned his personal property, and told him he was free to go wherever he wished. Ahenobarbus was so shocked he couldn't speak. He eventually mumbled thanks and fled toward Pompey's forces, but the damage was done. Every Roman in Italy heard the story within days. Caesar's soldiers were less enthusiastic about the clemency policy. They had risked their lives crossing the Rubicon and capturing enemy positions. In traditional Roman warfare, that entitled them to loot and slaves as payment for their service. Now their general was letting valuable prisoners walk away for free, but Caesar understood his men well enough to manage their complaints. He increased their regular pay, promised them bonuses from captured treasuries, and reminded them that civil war loot was different from foreign conquest wealth. These weren't barbarian enemies. They were fellow Romans who might be allies tomorrow. More importantly, Caesar's clemency was creating a snowball effect that made further fighting unnecessary. Every pardoned enemy became a walking advertisement for Caesar's reasonableness. Every general who switched sides brought his troops with him. Caesar's army was growing faster through defections than Pompey's was growing through recruitment. The psychological warfare was devastating to Republican morale. Pompey had expected to fight a desperate rebel backed by foreign mercenaries and Gallic barbarians. Instead, he faced a Roman general who seemed more committed to Republican values than Pompey's own supporters were. The climax of the Italian campaign came when Pompey made his fateful decision to abandon the peninsula entirely. From a strategic standpoint, the choice made sense. Italy was lost, but Pompey controlled the eastern provinces where most of Rome's wealth and manpower were located. He could retreat to Greece, gather overwhelming forces, and return to crush Caesar at his leisure. But politically, the retreat was a disaster. Pompey was abandoning Rome itself, the city he had sworn to protect. Worse, he was leaving behind senators, magistrates, and ordinary citizens who had supported him. They would have to choose between fleeing into exile or submitting to Caesar's mercy. Caesar reached the port of Brundisium just as Pompey's last ships were disappearing over the horizon. The two men who had once been partners were now separated by the width of the Adriatic Sea. Behind Caesar lay Italy, subdued but not conquered. Ahead lay the greater challenge of pursuing Pompey to the east and settling their rivalry once and for all. But first, Caesar had to consolidate his position in Italy and deal with the practical problems of governing a state that was technically still at war with him. The Senate had fled with Pompey, taking the legitimacy of republican government with them. Caesar controlled Rome, but he needed to create new institutions that could function without traditional constitutional authority. Caesar's solution was typically pragmatic. He appointed magistrates to fill vacant positions, recalled exiles who had been driven out by his enemies, and began the process of recruiting new legions from Italian communities that had never before provided soldiers for Roman armies. Most controversially, Caesar opened the treasury in the Temple of Saturn and took the gold reserves that were supposed to fund Rome's defence in extreme emergencies. When the tribune Metellus tried to stop him, Caesar made it clear that his patience with constitutional niceties had limits. "Young man," Caesar told Metellus, "you know it was harder for me to say this than it would be to do it." The threat was politely phrased but unmistakable. Caesar would prefer to work through legal channels, but he wouldn't let legal technicalities prevent him from funding the war effort. The Italian campaign had taken less than 3 months, but it had fundamentally changed the balance of power in the Roman world. Caesar now controlled Italy, Rome, and the loyalty of at least half the Roman army. He had proven that his crossing of the Rubicon wasn't a desperate gamble, but a calculated move by someone who understood Roman politics better than his enemies did. But Caesar also understood that his Italian victories were just the beginning. Pompey commanded the eastern provinces, Spain, and most of the Roman fleet. The war would be decided not in Italian towns but on distant battlefields, where Caesar's clemency might matter less than his tactical skills. Section 12. Dyrrachium and Pharsalus, 400 words. Caesar couldn't follow Pompey to Greece immediately. He lacked the ships for a major amphibious operation, and Pompey's fleet controlled the eastern Mediterranean. Instead, Caesar decided to eliminate Pompey's forces in Spain before turning east, a strategy he summarized with typical directness. "I go to fight an army without a general, so that I may later fight a general without an army." The Spanish campaign was swift and successful. Pompey's lieutenants, cut off from reinforcements and facing Caesar's veteran legions, surrendered after a brief series of engagements. Caesar's clemency policy worked as well in Spain as it had in Italy. Most of the captured troops joined his army rather than face continued resistance. But while Caesar was in Spain, Pompey was using the time to gather the largest army Rome had ever assembled. Contingents arrived from Syria, Asia Minor, Egypt, and every eastern province still loyal to the Republic. The kings of Numidia, Galatia, and Cappadocia sent troops and gold. Even the Parthians, despite their recent victory over Crassus, offered to support Pompey against his Roman rival. By early 48 BC, Pompey commanded nearly 50,000 legionaries plus auxiliary troops, cavalry, and a fleet that controlled every major port from Greece to Egypt. His camp at Dyrrachium in western Greece had become the temporary capital of the Roman Republic in exile, complete with a senate, magistrates, and the full apparatus of republican government. Caesar finally crossed the Adriatic in January 48 BC, but winter storms and Pompey's naval blockade prevented him from bringing his entire army. He landed in Greece with only 7 legions, about 35,000 men, while another 4 legions remained stranded in Italy under Mark Antony's command. The campaign that followed tested Caesar's military genius more severely than anything he had faced in Gaul. Pompey was no barbarian chieftain fighting with outdated tactics. He was Rome's most successful general, commanding disciplined Roman legions supported by the resources of half the empire. More importantly, Pompey had learned from Caesar's earlier victories. Instead of seeking immediate battle, he used his superior numbers and naval support to wage a war of attrition. Pompey's forces controlled the coastline, making it difficult for Caesar to receive supplies or reinforcements. His cavalry dominated the inland routes, harassing Caesar's foraging parties and limiting his army's mobility. Caesar found himself in the unfamiliar position of being outmaneuvered by an opponent who understood his methods. When Caesar tried to force a battle, Pompey retreated to fortified positions. When Caesar attempted siege operations, Pompey's fleet would land troops behind Roman lines. It was like fighting a more experienced version of himself. The crisis came at Dyrrhachium, where Caesar attempted to besiege Pompey's main base using the same double-wall tactics that had worked at Alesia. But the situations were completely different. Alesia had been an isolated hilltop fortress that Caesar could surround completely. Dyrrhachium was a coastal city that Pompey's fleet could resupply indefinitely. Worse, Caesar's army was running short of food, while Pompey's men ate well from supplies delivered by sea. Caesar's soldiers were reduced to eating bread made from roots and bark. They even joked about it, throwing loaves over Pompey's walls with notes saying they would never surrender as long as the earth produced such food. Pompey's response to the food shortage showed his growing confidence. He launched a carefully planned attack on Caesar's siege lines at their weakest point, where rocky terrain had prevented proper fortification. The assault succeeded brilliantly, breaking through Caesar's outer wall and threatening to roll up his entire position. For a few terrifying hours it looked like Caesar's army might be destroyed completely. His men fled in panic as Pompey's veterans pushed through the breach. Caesar himself grabbed a shield and rushed into the fighting, trying desperately to rally his broken troops. "Where are you running?" Caesar shouted at his fleeing soldiers. "The enemy is that way." But his usual charisma failed him. The men who had followed him across the Rubicon and through Italy were now running for their lives, convinced their general had finally met his match. Caesar managed to extract most of his army from the disaster, but the defeat at Dyrrhachium was the worst of his career. He lost nearly 1,000 men killed and many more wounded or captured. More importantly, he had lost the aura of invincibility that had been his greatest weapon since the Gallic Wars began. Pompey's supporters were ecstatic. Finally, the upstart who had defied the Senate had met a real general and been crushed. Messages went out to Rome's allies throughout the eastern Mediterranean. Caesar was finished, the Republic would be restored, and those who had supported the rebel would face appropriate punishment. But Pompey made a crucial error. Instead of pursuing Caesar's defeated army and destroying it completely, he decided to let his enemy retreat inland where terrain would favor defensive operations. Pompey's advisors argued for immediate pursuit, but Pompey refused to risk his advantage in a hasty chase. "I would rather be called a cautious general than a lucky one," Pompey reportedly said. It was exactly the kind of measured thinking that had made him successful in his earlier campaigns. But Caesar wasn't a normal enemy, and this wasn't a normal war. Caesar used his retreat to regroup and rethink his strategy. He couldn't win a war of attrition against an enemy with superior resources and supply lines, but he could still force Pompey to fight on ground that favored Roman tactical skills over logistical advantages. The opportunity came when Pompey finally decided to move inland, away from his coastal supply bases. Pressure from his senatorial allies forced the decision. They were tired of defensive warfare and demanded the decisive victory that would let them return to Rome as liberators. The two armies maneuvered around each other through the hills of central Greece, each commander looking for the perfect opportunity to attack. Caesar's men were hungry and tired, but they were also angry about their defeat at Dyrrhachium. They wanted revenge, and Caesar promised they would have it. The battle finally came on August 9th, 48 BC, on the plains near Pharsalus. Pompey had chosen the ground carefully, a broad flat area where his superior numbers and cavalry would have maximum effect. He deployed his legions in traditional Roman formation, with his best troops on the flanks and his cavalry massed on the right wing. Caesar's deployment was more creative. Recognizing that Pompey's cavalry outnumbered his own by nearly 3-1, Caesar created a fourth line of infantry behind his normal battle formation. These troops were specially trained to fight cavalry, equipped with long spears instead of the usual Roman swords. The battle began with Pompey's cavalry charge, exactly as both commanders had expected. Caesar's horsemen were quickly overwhelmed and forced to retreat, leaving his right flank exposed to attack. It looked like Pompey's superior numbers were about to win the day. Then Caesar committed his secret fourth line. The specially equipped infantry smashed into Pompey's cavalry, just as they were turning to attack Caesar's exposed flank. The unexpected assault caught the horsemen completely off guard. They had never faced infantry trained specifically for anti-cavalry warfare. Pompey's cavalry broke and fled, leaving his own infantry flank exposed. Caesar immediately ordered a general advance, and his battle-hardened veterans crashed into Pompey's lines with the fury of men who had something to prove after their defeat at Dyrrhachium. The fighting was savage but brief. Pompey's army included many new recruits who had never faced Caesar's Gallic veterans in close combat. When their cavalry abandoned them and Caesar's men began their trademark systematic advance, morale collapsed quickly. Pompey himself fled the battlefield before the fighting was over, reportedly saying, "What, even in my camp," when he saw Caesar's soldiers pursuing his men into the Republican base. The man who'd been called Magnus the Great was reduced to a refugee running for his life from an enemy he had defeated just months earlier. The Battle of Pharsalus effectively ended the Republican cause, though scattered resistance would continue for years. Caesar destroyed Pompey's main army and captured most of the senatorial leadership. The eastern provinces, deprived of military protection, would have no choice but to submit to the victor. But Caesar's behavior after the battle showed how much the civil war had changed him. When his soldiers began massacring Republican prisoners, Caesar rode among them personally, knocking weapons from their hands and ordering them to spare the defeated. "Enough, soldiers," Caesar shouted. "We have won. Now let us show mercy to our fellow Romans." It was the same clemency policy he had followed throughout the Civil War, but now it required physical intervention to enforce. Caesar spent hours walking through the battlefield, ordering medical care for wounded enemies and arranging proper burial for the dead. When someone brought him Pompey's abandoned correspondence, which included letters from Romans who had secretly supported the Republican cause, Caesar burned the entire collection without reading it. The victory at Pharsalus had made Caesar master of the Roman world, but it had also made him responsible for healing the wounds that civil war had inflicted. He would spend the rest of his life trying to reunite Romans who had spent years trying to kill each other. Section 13, Egypt and Cleopatra, to 300 words. Caesar's pursuit of Pompey led him to Alexandria, the greatest city in the ancient world after Rome itself. Built by Alexander the Great 3 centuries earlier, Alexandria was where Greek learning met Egyptian wealth and Roman ambition. Its famous lighthouse guided ships from across the Mediterranean to harbours filled with grain, papyrus, and exotic goods from Africa and India. But Caesar arrived to find the city in chaos. Egypt was in the middle of a civil war between the pharaoh Ptolemy III and his sister Cleopatra VII, who were supposed to rule jointly, but had instead spent years fighting for sole control. Roman merchants were fleeing. The harbour was full of warships from both sides, and nobody seemed to know who actually controlled the government. Caesar's first priority was finding Pompey, who had fled to Egypt seeking sanctuary after his defeat at Pharsalus. But when Caesar's ship reached Alexandria's harbour, a small boat came out to meet him with news that changed everything. Pompey was dead, murdered by Ptolemy's advisers who thought his head would make a nice gift for the victorious Caesar. The assassination had been planned by Pothinus, Ptolemy's chief minister, and carried out by Achillas, the royal guard commander. They reasoned that Caesar would be grateful to the people who had eliminated his greatest enemy. They were catastrophically wrong about Caesar's character. When the Egyptians presented Pompey's head and signet ring as proof of their loyalty, Caesar turned away in disgust. Pompey had been his rival, his enemy, even his son-in-law's husband. But he had also been a great Roman who deserved better than assassination by foreign courtiers seeking political advantage. Caesar's grief was genuine. Despite their civil war, he and Pompey had been partners for years. They had shared power, wealth, and family connections. Julia, Caesar's beloved daughter, had loved Pompey deeply and been loved by him in return. Now the man was dead, killed not by Roman steel in honest battle, but by Egyptian daggers in a cowardly ambush. The murder also created a practical problem for Caesar. Pompey's death removed the main justification for Caesar's pursuit to Egypt. He could have loaded his legions back onto their ships and returned to Rome as master of the Mediterranean world. Instead, he decided to stay in Alexandria and involve himself in Egypt's civil war. The decision was partly political. Egypt was too important to remain unstable, and partly personal. Caesar was curious about the legendary city and its famous queen. Cleopatra Ctesiphon was 21 years old, highly educated, and reportedly one of the most intelligent women of her generation. She was also fighting for her throne against a brother backed by the same advisors who had murdered Pompey. Caesar's meeting with Cleopatra became one of the most famous encounters in ancient history, though we only have later Roman accounts of what actually happened. According to these stories, Cleopatra had herself smuggled into Caesar's quarters, rolled up in a carpet or bundle of bedclothes, carried past Ptolemy's guards by a loyal servant. The dramatic entrance was calculated to impress Caesar, and it worked. Here was a young woman who combined royal dignity with personal courage, intellectual brilliance with political desperation. She spoke 9 languages fluently, including Latin, something that would have impressed Caesar, who valued education and cultured conversation. More importantly, Cleopatra understood something about Caesar that his enemies had missed. He wasn't just another Roman general seeking loot and glory. Caesar was trying to create something new, an empire that could unite different peoples under Roman leadership without destroying their individual cultures and traditions. Egypt could be a model for this vision. The Ptolemaic dynasty had ruled Egypt for 3 centuries while preserving Egyptian religion, art and customs. The country was fabulously wealthy, efficiently administered, and strategically located at the crossroads between Europe, Asia and Africa. An alliance with Egypt could give Caesar resources and legitimacy that no other partnership could provide. The attraction between Caesar and Cleopatra was both political and personal. Caesar was 52 years old, experienced in warfare and politics, but still vigorous and charismatic. Cleopatra was young, beautiful, and intellectually stimulating in ways that Roman women, constrained by their culture's limitations on female education, often couldn't match. But their alliance immediately created a military crisis. Ptolemy's advisors, realizing that Caesar supported their enemy, decided to eliminate the Roman threat before it could grow stronger. They assembled the royal guard, about 20,000 men, and besieged Caesar in the palace district of Alexandria. Caesar found himself trapped with fewer than 4,000 soldiers in a hostile city. Cut off from reinforcements and surrounded by enemies who had already proven their willingness to murder inconvenient Romans. It was the most desperate situation of his career, worse even than his defeat at Dyrrhachium. The siege of Alexandria lasted for months. Caesar's men controlled only the palace complex and the harbour, while Ptolemy's forces held the rest of the city. Egyptian engineers tried to poison the Romans' water supply by diverting seawater into their wells. Caesar's soldiers had to dig new wells at night, working by torchlight while under constant attack from Egyptian archers. The fighting was unlike anything Caesar had experienced in Gaul or the Civil War. Urban warfare in Alexandria's narrow streets favoured defenders who knew the terrain. Egyptian tactics relied on sudden raids, ambushes and siege equipment that could attack Roman positions from multiple directions simultaneously. Caesar's engineering skills, developed during years of Gallic sieges, proved crucial for survival. His men fortified the palace district with walls and towers that could withstand Egyptian catapults. They constructed ballistae, giant crossbows, that could shoot bolts through Egyptian shields and armour. Most importantly, they maintained control of the harbour, which allowed supply ships from friendly territories to reach them. The most famous incident of the siege was the burning of part of Alexandria's great library. Caesar's men were fighting Egyptian ships in the harbour when fires spread from the burning vessels to nearby warehouses that stored books and scrolls. Ancient sources disagree about how much of the library was actually destroyed, but the incident became symbolic of the cultural costs of Roman expansion. Caesar himself seemed genuinely distressed by the library's damage. He had always been a patron of learning and literature. The idea that his war might have destroyed irreplaceable works of Greek and Egyptian scholarship bothered him more than military setbacks that cost Roman lives. Relief finally came when reinforcements arrived from Asia Minor under Mithridates of Pergamon, one of Caesar's allies. The combined Roman-Egyptian force broke Ptolemy's siege and drove his army from Alexandria. Ptolemy himself drowned when his ship capsized during the retreat. Whether by accident or Roman design remains unclear. Caesar's victory in the Alexandrian War established him as pharaoh in all but name. He placed Cleopatra on the throne as sole ruler of Egypt, backed by Roman military power and bound to Rome by their personal alliance. Egypt's vast wealth, grain, gold, and the profits from Indian Ocean trade would now support Caesar's growing empire. But Caesar's relationship with Cleopatra was about more than political convenience. During their months together in Alexandria, she became pregnant with his child. The boy, born in 47 BC, was named Caesarion, Little Caesar, and would become a symbol of the Roman-Egyptian alliance that Caesar hoped would transform the ancient world. The relationship scandalized conservative Romans, who saw it as proof that Caesar was abandoning Roman values for Eastern decadence. Cleopatra was a foreign queen who claimed descent from Alexander the Great's generals. Her court followed Greek and Egyptian customs that Romans considered effeminate and corrupting. Worse, she practiced a form of monarchy that was fundamentally incompatible with republican traditions. But Caesar saw the alliance differently. Rome's expansion had created an empire too diverse to be governed by Italian city-state institutions. The future belonged to leaders who could unite different peoples while respecting their individual cultures. Cleopatra represented that multicultural vision, a Macedonian queen ruling an Egyptian kingdom with Roman support. Caesar's stay in Alexandria also gave him time to study Egyptian administration, which was far more sophisticated than Roman provincial government. The Ptolemies had created a bureaucracy that could efficiently collect taxes, maintain public works, and coordinate economic activity across the entire Nile Valley. Their methods could be adapted for use throughout the Roman Empire. When Caesar finally left Egypt in 47 BC, he took with him more than just military victory and political alliance. He had gained a new understanding of how to rule diverse populations and a vision of empire that went beyond simple conquest and exploitation. The lessons he learned in Alexandria would influence his policies for the rest of his career. But Caesar also left behind a son whose existence would complicate Roman politics for decades. Caesarion was living proof of Caesar's Eastern entanglements and his willingness to break with traditional Roman values. The boy would eventually become a pawn in the power struggles that followed Caesar's death. The months in Alexandria had transformed Caesar from a Roman general into something unprecedented. A world leader who could function equally well in different cultures, while maintaining the loyalty of diverse peoples. It was exactly the kind of leadership the Roman Empire needed, but it was also the kind of leadership that traditional Romans found most threatening. Section 14. Africa and Spain, the final campaigns, to 100 words. Caesar left Egypt in 47 BC, believing the civil war was essentially over. Pompey was dead. His eastern armies were destroyed, and most republican leaders had either been killed or pardoned. But Caesar underestimated the determination of his remaining enemies and the appeal of the republican cause to Romans who refused to accept one-man rule. The surviving republicans had regrouped in North Africa under the leadership of Cato the Younger, Pompey's old ally and Caesar's most persistent critic. Cato had always been more than just a political opponent. He was a moral force who represented traditional Roman values in their purest form. Unlike other senators who opposed Caesar for personal reasons, Cato genuinely believed that the Republic was worth dying for. Cato had gathered the remnants of Pompey's cause in the kingdom of Numidia, where King Juba provided troops and supplies for one last attempt to restore republican government. The African army included veteran legions that had escaped from earlier defeats, Numidian cavalry renowned throughout the Mediterranean, and war elephants that terrified Roman soldiers who had never faced such beasts. But the Republicans' greatest strength was also their greatest weakness. They were united by shared principles rather than personal loyalty to a single leader. That made them harder to bribe or intimidate, but it also made them prone to internal disputes about strategy and command structure. Caesar landed in Africa in late 47 BC with 4 legions, about 20,000 men, and immediately faced the kind of tactical challenges that had made him famous in Gaul. The Republicans controlled most of the countryside, forcing Caesar to operate from a narrow coastal foothold while his enemies chose when and where to fight. The African terrain favoured cavalry warfare, and the Republicans had far superior mounted forces. Numidian horsemen could appear from nowhere, attack Roman supply columns, and disappear before Caesar's infantry could respond. It was like fighting ghosts who struck without warning and vanished into the desert. Caesar adapted to these conditions with typical creativity. He recruited local allies who knew the terrain and could match Numidian mobility. He modified Roman tactical formations to defend against cavalry charges. Most importantly, he used his engineering skills to build fortified camps that could protect his army during the vulnerable process of establishing supply lines. The decisive battle came at Thapsus in 46 BC, where Caesar managed to force the Republicans to fight on ground that favoured Roman infantry tactics. The engagement began when Republican war elephants, frightened by Roman trumpets and war cries, turned and charged through their own battle lines. The sight of massive elephants trampling their own troops broke Republican morale before the real fighting even began. Caesar's veterans, experienced in exploiting enemy confusion, launched an immediate assault that shattered what remained of organized resistance. But the aftermath of Thapsus revealed something disturbing about Caesar's army. His soldiers, brutalized by months of guerrilla warfare and frustrated by the Republicans' refusal to accept defeat, began massacring prisoners despite Caesar's orders for mercy. The same men who had shown restraint at Pharsalus now killed surrendering enemies without discrimination. Caesar himself tried to stop the slaughter, riding among his men and physically restraining soldiers who were executing captives. But his control was incomplete. The civil war had lasted too long and cost too much for either side to maintain the civilized behavior that had characterized its earlier phases. The massacre at Thapsus marked a turning point in Caesar's relationship with his own army. His soldiers remained loyal, but they were no longer the disciplined professionals who had crossed the Rubicon. Years of civil war had coarsened them, making them less responsive to their general's moral authority and more willing to take revenge on enemies who had prolonged the conflict unnecessarily. Cato's response to the defeat at Thapsus showed why Caesar had always considered him the most dangerous of his opponents. Rather than fleeing to fight another day or seeking terms for surrender, Cato chose suicide. He spent his final night reading Plato's dialogue on the immortality of the soul, then fell on his sword at dawn. Cato's death created the martyrdom that Caesar had tried to prevent through his clemency policy. The man who had embodied republican virtue was now a symbol of principled resistance to tyranny. His suicide implied that life under Caesar's rule was worse than death itself, a powerful propaganda weapon for anyone who wanted to oppose the new regime. Caesar's reaction to news of Cato's death was complex. He reportedly said he begrudged Cato his death, meaning he wished his enemy had chosen to live and accept pardon rather than become a martyr. Caesar understood that dead enemies could sometimes be more dangerous than living ones, but even Cato's martyrdom couldn't revive the Republican cause in Africa. The remaining leaders were killed, captured, or fled to distant provinces. King Juba died fighting, and his kingdom was absorbed into the Roman Empire as the province of Africa Nova. The African campaign was over. However, one major Republican stronghold remained: Spain, where Pompey's sons Gnaeus and Sextus had raised new armies and controlled most of the Iberian Peninsula. Unlike the African Republicans, who had fought for abstract principles, Pompey's sons were fighting for personal revenge and family honour. The Spanish War was the most brutal campaign of Caesar's career. Both sides understood it would be the final act of the civil war, with no quarter given or expected. The younger Pompeians had learned from their father's mistakes. They avoided pitched battles, used guerrilla tactics, and recruited local tribes who had no love for Roman rule. Caesar's army was also different from the force that had conquered Gaul. These weren't eager volunteers seeking glory and wealth. They were war-weary veterans who wanted to go home to families they hadn't seen in years. Some had been fighting continuously since the Rubicon crossing 7 years earlier. The decisive engagement came at Munda in 45 BC, a battle that Caesar later called the hardest fight of his career. Unlike his earlier victories, where superior tactics and timing had decided the outcome quickly, Munda was a grinding slugfest where both armies stood and traded casualties for hours. At one point, Caesar's line began to waver under pressure from Pompey's Spanish recruits, who fought with the desperation of men defending their homeland. Caesar himself grabbed a shield and sword and ran into the front ranks, shouting to his men that they had followed him this far and couldn't abandon him now. The sight of their 55-year-old general fighting beside them in the battle line rallied Caesar's veterans for one final effort. They pushed forward with the fury of men who saw their commander risking his life alongside theirs, and Pompey's army finally broke and scattered. Gnaeus Pompey was killed trying to escape. His younger brother Sextus fled to the mountains with a handful of followers, where he would continue guerrilla warfare for several more years. But organized Republican resistance was finally over. Caesar had won the civil war completely. The Spanish victory came at enormous cost. Caesar's army suffered heavier casualties at Munda than in any previous battle. Entire cohorts that had served since the Gallic Wars were reduced to skeleton strength. The survivors were exhausted, traumatized, and eager to return to civilian life after nearly a decade of continuous warfare. Caesar himself was changed by the Spanish campaign. The man who had once charmed pirates and shown mercy to defeated enemies had become harder, more ruthless, less patient with opposition. The civil war had lasted too long and required too many compromises with his own principles. But Caesar had also achieved something unprecedented in Roman history. He had reunited the empire under single leadership, ended the cycle of civil wars that had plagued Rome for generations, and proven that one man could govern territories stretching from Britain to Egypt. The Republic was dead, but something potentially greater had taken its place. The question now was whether Caesar could transform his military conquest into lasting political institutions. He had won the war, but winning the peace would require different skills and different compromises. The man who returned to Rome from Spain in 45 BC was master of the known world, but he still had to prove he knew what to do with that mastery. Caesar returned to Rome in 45 BC as something the city had never seen before, the undisputed master of the entire Mediterranean world. There were no more enemies to fight, no more rivals to defeat, no more territories to conquer. For the first time in decades, the Roman world was at peace. The question was what Caesar would do with that peace. The city that welcomed him was exhausted by 20 years of civil war and social upheaval. The population had grown to over 1 million people, but many were unemployed citizens surviving on free grain distributions. The streets were crowded with veterans from disbanded armies, former slaves seeking work, and refugees from war-torn provinces who had nowhere else to go. Rome's infrastructure was collapsing under the strain. The old republican system had been designed to govern a city-state, not a world empire. Aqueducts needed repair, roads required maintenance, and the harbour at Ostia was silting up from neglect. The city needed massive investment and systematic planning that only a single authority could provide. Caesar threw himself into the work of reconstruction with the same energy he had brought to military campaigns. He launched building projects that employed thousands of workers, new forums, temples, theatres, and basilicas that would make Rome worthy of its position as capital of the world. The Forum Julium, Caesar's personal contribution to the city's ceremonial heart, featured a temple to Venus Genetrix, the goddess from whom Caesar's family claimed descent. But Caesar's building projects went beyond mere decoration. He planned practical improvements that would make Rome function better as an imperial capital. New aqueducts would bring fresh water from distant mountains. An improved harbour at Ostia would handle the grain ships that fed the city's population. Roads radiating out from Rome would connect the capital with every corner of the empire. The most ambitious project was Caesar's plan to drain the Pontine marshes south of Rome and dig a canal across the Isthmus of Corinth in Greece. These weren't just engineering challenges, they were statements about Roman power and Caesar's vision of what that power could accomplish. If successful, they would create new farmland for Italian settlers and a shipping route that would revolutionize Mediterranean trade. Caesar also tackled the calendar, one of the most persistent problems in Roman life. The traditional Roman year was based on lunar months that didn't match the solar cycle, requiring frequent adjustments that had become hopelessly confused during the Civil War years. Some months had been added or subtracted so arbitrarily that the calendar was nearly 3 months out of sync with the seasons. Working with Egyptian astronomers he had met in Alexandria, Caesar created a new solar calendar that would remain accurate indefinitely. The Julian calendar added extra days to bring the year in line with the sun's cycle, then established a system of leap years that would prevent future drift. It was a technical achievement that required sophisticated mathematical knowledge and careful observation of celestial movements. The calendar reform was typical of Caesar's approach to government: practical, thorough, and based on the best knowledge available from throughout the empire. He wasn't content to patch up the old system's problems. He wanted to create new institutions that would work better for centuries to come. Caesar's legal reforms were equally ambitious. He standardized laws throughout the empire, replacing the confusing mixture of local customs, provincial regulations, and Roman statutes that had accumulated over centuries of conquest. Citizens would have the same rights whether they lived in Spain, Gaul, or Asia Minor. Justice would be administered according to consistent principles rather than the whims of individual governors. Most controversially, Caesar expanded the definition of Roman citizenship itself. He granted citizenship to entire communities in Gaul and Spain that had supported him during the civil wars. He allowed talented foreigners to join the Senate regardless of their birthplace. He even appointed some Gallic chiefs as Roman magistrates, giving them authority over the very Romans who had once conquered their tribes. Traditional Romans were horrified by these innovations. They saw citizenship as something precious that should be reserved for people of Italian birth and Roman culture. Allowing barbarians to become senators violated everything they believed about Roman superiority and cultural purity. But Caesar understood something his critics didn't. Rome's empire had grown too large and diverse to be governed by Italian prejudices. The future belonged to leaders who could unite different peoples under Roman law while respecting their individual traditions. The alternative was constant rebellion and the eventual collapse of imperial authority. Caesar's personal behavior as dictator was carefully calculated to avoid offending republican sensibilities while establishing his own authority. He refused the title of king, even when Mark Antony offered him a crown during the Lupercalia festival in 44 BC. Instead, he accepted the position of dictator perpetuo, dictator for life, which gave him royal power while maintaining the fiction of republican institutions. Caesar also made a point of showing respect for the Senate, even though everyone knew the body had been reduced to rubber stamping his decisions. He addressed the senators courteously, asked for their advice on important matters, and appointed former enemies to important positions. The forms of republican government were preserved even as their substance disappeared. But Caesar's reforms created as many problems as they solved. Veterans from his armies expected rewards for their service, land grants, money, and government positions that displaced existing property owners and office holders. The massive building projects required enormous amounts of money that had to be extracted from provincial taxes. The expansion of citizenship created a bureaucratic nightmare as administrators tried to determine who qualified for what rights. More fundamentally, Caesar's reforms challenged every assumption about how Roman society should function. Traditional families who had dominated politics for centuries found themselves competing with newcomers who owed their positions to Caesar's favour rather than ancestral achievement. The old system of personal relationships and inherited obligations was being replaced by something that looked suspiciously like Oriental despotism. Caesar's relationship with Cleopatra became a particular source of scandal. The Egyptian queen arrived in Rome in 46 BC with their son Caesarion, taking up residence in a villa across the Tiber, where she held court like a foreign monarch. Romans who visited her found a woman who spoke perfect Latin, but followed Egyptian customs and claimed descent from Alexander the Great. The liaison with Cleopatra symbolized everything traditional Romans feared about Caesar's transformation. Here was their dictator consorting with a foreign queen, producing children who might claim inheritance rights to Roman power, and apparently planning to rule the empire like an Eastern potentate rather than a Roman magistrate. Caesar's public appearances became increasingly regal despite his refusal of the royal title. He wore a golden wreath at public ceremonies, sat on an ivory throne during Senate meetings, and accepted divine honours that no previous Roman had dared claim. Statues of Caesar appeared in temples alongside images of the gods. His birthday became a public festival. Some provinces began worshipping him as a living deity. The divine honours were partly practical. Emperor worship would become a standard way of uniting diverse peoples under Roman rule. But they also reflected Caesar's growing isolation from normal human relationships. The man who had once charmed pirates and joked with soldiers was now surrounded by courtiers who treated him like a god. Caesar's health was also deteriorating. He suffered from epileptic seizures that reminded everyone of his mortality despite his divine pretensions. Friends noticed that he was becoming more impatient with opposition, more suspicious of potential rivals, more willing to use force rather than persuasion to get his way. The most telling sign of Caesar's changing character was his treatment of Marcus Cicero, Rome's greatest living orator and a consistent critic of autocratic government. Instead of having Cicero killed or exiled, the normal fate of persistent opponents, Caesar kept him in Rome as a kind of pet intellectual, occasionally asking for his opinions while making it clear that those opinions carried no real weight. Cicero's position was humiliating but revealing. Caesar wanted to be seen as a cultured ruler who valued learning and debate, even when that debate was purely ceremonial. It was the kind of sophisticated cruelty that showed how completely Caesar had mastered the art of power. But Caesar's greatest challenge wasn't administrative or political, it was psychological. He had spent his entire adult life climbing towards supreme power, overcoming every obstacle through intelligence, charisma, and ruthless determination. Now that he had achieved his goal, what was left to accomplish? Caesar's answer was characteristically ambitious. He planned new military campaigns that would expand Roman territory beyond anything previously imagined. A war against the Parthians would avenge Crassus's defeat and secure Rome's eastern frontier. Expeditions beyond the Rhine and Danube would complete the conquest of Europe. Some even spoke of campaigns against the mysterious lands beyond India and Africa. These plans revealed something important about Caesar's psychology. He couldn't simply govern the empire he had won. He needed new worlds to conquer, new challenges to overcome, new victories to add to his legend. The man who had crossed the Rubicon couldn't be satisfied with peaceful administration of territories already subdued. But Caesar's military plans also created new sources of opposition among Romans who were tired of war and conquest. His veterans wanted to retire to their farms and enjoy the wealth they had earned through years of fighting. Senators hoped for a return to normal politics without the constant threat of military campaigns. Even Caesar's supporters began to wonder whether their leader had become addicted to warfare for its own sake. The Eastern campaign against Parthia was scheduled to begin in March 44 BC. Caesar would leave Rome with the largest army ever assembled, 16 legions plus auxiliary forces, nearly 100,000 men total. The campaign was expected to last several years and would take Caesar far from Italy during the crucial period when his new institutions needed careful nurturing. Many Romans worried that Caesar's absence would create the same kind of power vacuum that had followed Pompey's eastern campaigns decades earlier. Who would govern Rome while the dictator was fighting in Mesopotamia? What would happen if Caesar were killed or defeated in some distant desert? Had he created a system that could function without his personal supervision? These concerns were shared by some of Caesar's closest allies, who began to wonder whether their leader had lost touch with political reality. The man who had once been the most skilled politician of his generation was now making decisions based on personal ambition rather than collective wisdom. Caesar seemed oblivious to the growing doubts about his leadership. He was planning triumphs, organizing parades, and designing monuments to commemorate victories he hadn't yet won. The boy who had once hidden in the Subura's back alleys had become intoxicated by his own power, but other Romans were watching Caesar's behavior with growing alarm. They saw a leader who had saved the Republic from chaos, but might now destroy it through megalomania. They remembered Cato's warnings about the dangers of one-man rule, and began to wonder whether the old senator had been right after all. Section 16, the conspiracy form, the 2,000 words. The conspiracy against Caesar didn't begin with a dramatic moment or a secret meeting in some shadowy location. It grew slowly, like a rumor spreading through Rome's neighborhoods, as more and more people began to believe that their dictator had become a threat to everything they valued about Roman civilization. The first conspirators weren't Caesar's enemies, they were his friends. Marcus Junius Brutus was the most trusted of Caesar's protégés, a young senator whose family had founded the Republic by driving out the last king 5 centuries earlier. Caesar had pardoned Brutus after Pharsalus, promoted him to high office, and treated him almost like a son. But Brutus was also an idealist who genuinely believed in republican values. He'd grown up hearing stories about his ancestor Lucius Junius Brutus, who had chosen duty to Rome over personal loyalty when he executed his own sons for plotting to restore the monarchy. The family motto was simple: death before dishonour, republic before personal relationships. Gaius Cassius Longinus was different from Brutus in temperament, but shared his political convictions. Cassius was practical where Brutus was philosophical, cynical where Brutus was idealistic, but equally committed to the principle that no one man should rule Rome. He had also been pardoned by Caesar and given important positions, but he saw these honours as attempts to buy his silence rather than genuine recognition of his abilities. The two men began meeting privately in late 44 BC, sharing their concerns about Caesar's increasing autocracy. They weren't plotting assassination yet, just discussing whether someone should try to convince Caesar to restore normal republican government voluntarily. But their conversations gradually attracted others who shared similar concerns. Decimus Junius Brutus Albinus was Caesar's most trusted lieutenant, the man who had commanded fleets during the Gallic Wars and received enormous rewards for his loyalty. Yet even Decimus was beginning to worry about Caesar's plans for permanent dictatorship. Gaius Trebonius had served as Caesar's consul and governed Asia as his representative. Publius Servilius Casca had fought in Caesar's armies and received promotions based on merit rather than birth. These weren't disgruntled enemies or jealous rivals. They were successful men who owed their positions to Caesar's favour, but feared what he was becoming. The conspiracy grew because Caesar's reforms had created a class of Romans who were personally loyal to him, but philosophically committed to republican institutions. They wanted to preserve what Caesar had given them, while preventing him from destroying what their ancestors had built. The conspirators' meetings became more frequent and more serious as Caesar's behaviour grew more disturbing. His acceptance of divine honours particularly troubled men who had been raised to believe that Romans were citizens, not subjects of divine kings. When Caesar allowed his statue to be placed in the Temple of Quirinus alongside the deified Romulus, even his supporters began to wonder whether he had lost his mind. Caesar's relationship with Cleopatra provided another source of concern. The Egyptian queen's presence in Rome suggested that Caesar was planning some kind of dynastic marriage that would transform the Republic into an Oriental monarchy. Rumours spread that Caesar intended to move the capital to Alexandria or establish Caesarion as his heir, bypassing the Senate and Roman people entirely. But the conspirators' most immediate concern was Caesar's planned Parthian campaign. Once Caesar left Rome with 16 legions, he would be even more isolated from normal political processes. Military commanders in distant provinces had enormous freedom to make decisions without consulting home authorities. What would prevent Caesar from declaring himself king while he was beyond the reach of Roman law? The conspiracy might have remained limited to philosophical discussions if not for the influence of Cicero, Rome's most respected defender of republican values. Cicero wasn't directly involved in the plot. The conspirators considered him too talkative to trust with dangerous secrets, but his speeches and writings provided intellectual justification for what they were contemplating. Cicero had been warning about the dangers of autocracy for years. His Philippics, speeches attacking Mark Antony, included broader criticisms of anyone who sought to rule Rome through personal authority rather than constitutional procedures. Though Cicero never explicitly called for Caesar's assassination, his arguments made it clear that he considered tyrannicide morally justified in extreme circumstances. The philosophical framework was important to men like Brutus, who needed to convince themselves that murder could be a noble act. Roman culture celebrated tyrannicides as heroes who had saved the state from despotism. Brutus's own ancestor was honoured for killing his sons to preserve republican institutions. If Caesar had truly become a tyrant, then killing him would be a patriotic duty rather than a criminal act. The conspiracy's turning point came when someone, probably Cassius, raised the possibility of taking direct action rather than continuing to hope that Caesar would reform voluntarily. The suggestion was initially rejected by most conspirators, who still hoped for a peaceful solution to their concerns. But events in early 44 BC convinced them that Caesar was moving too quickly toward absolute monarchy for gradual reform to be possible. The dictator had announced plans to extend his eastern campaign for several years, effectively removing himself from republican oversight indefinitely. He had also begun making appointments to magistracies years in advance, treating elected offices like personal gifts to be distributed at his pleasure. Most alarmingly, Caesar had started ignoring the Senate entirely on important matters. Instead of seeking senatorial advice on policy questions, he would announce decisions through edicts posted in the Forum. The body that had governed Rome for centuries was being reduced to a ceremonial assembly with no real authority. The conspirators realized that Caesar's reforms were creating momentum toward monarchy that would be impossible to reverse once he left for Parthia. If they were going to act, it would have to be soon, while Caesar was still in Rome and vulnerable to coordinated opposition. Recruiting additional conspirators proved surprisingly easy once the core group decided to move beyond discussion to action. Dozens of senators had private grievances against Caesar or philosophical objections to his rule. Many were willing to join a plot that promised to restore traditional republican government, but the conspiracy's growth also created security risks. With so many people involved, maintaining secrecy became increasingly difficult. Servants overheard conversations, wives noticed their husbands' unusual behaviour, and friends began asking pointed questions about the conspirators' frequent private meetings. The conspirators tried to manage these risks by limiting detailed planning to a small inner circle, while keeping peripheral members ignorant of specific plans. Most participants knew only that something was being organized to oppose Caesar. They didn't know when, where, or exactly what form the opposition would take. The decision to attempt assassination rather than some other form of resistance was made gradually, almost by default. The conspirators discussed various alternatives: kidnapping Caesar, forcing him into exile, surrounding him with guards who would limit his power. But all of these options required resources and coordination that the conspiracy couldn't provide. Assassination was simpler, quicker, and more certain to succeed if properly executed. It would eliminate Caesar permanently while sending a clear message to anyone else who might be tempted to seek autocratic power. Most importantly, it could be accomplished by a relatively small group of determined men without requiring popular uprisings or military support. The choice of location was equally practical. The conspirators needed somewhere they could approach Caesar without appearing suspicious, where security would be relatively light, and where they could escape quickly after the deed was done. The Senate House would have been perfect, but it was still being rebuilt after the fire during Clodius's riots. Instead, the Senate was meeting in the Theatre of Pompey, a complex that included meeting rooms suitable for official business. The irony was probably intentional. Caesar would be killed in a building named after his greatest rival, underneath a statue of the man he had defeated at Pharsalus. The date was set for March 15th, 44 BC, the Ides of March in the Roman calendar. It would be Caesar's last appearance before the Senate prior to his departure for the Eastern campaign. If the conspirators were going to act, this would be their final opportunity. But as the Ides of March approached, several conspirators began having second thoughts. The reality of what they were planning, the murder of Rome's most successful leader, was more disturbing than the abstract discussions that had led to their decision. Some worried about the practical consequences of creating a power vacuum. Others feared that they were making a terrible mistake that would plunge Rome back into civil war. Marcus Brutus was particularly troubled by doubts about the morality of their enterprise. Caesar had been generous to him personally and had never shown anything but friendship and trust. Was it right to repay that generosity with assassination? Could the murder of one man really restore republican government? Or would it simply create chaos that would be filled by someone worse than Caesar? But Brutus's wife Portia, daughter of the famous Cato, who had chosen suicide rather than live under Caesar's rule, encouraged her husband to follow his principles regardless of personal cost. She reminded him that his ancestor had been willing to kill his own sons to preserve the Republic. Surely Marcus Brutus could find the courage to kill Caesar to save Roman liberty. The conspirators' final meeting took place the night before the Ides of March. About 60 men had committed to participate in some way, though only about 20 would actually strike blows. The plan was simple. Surround Caesar when he took his seat in the Senate, present him with a petition as a pretext for approaching closely, then attack simultaneously before his bodyguards could intervene. Each conspirator would strike at least one blow to share collective responsibility for the deed. No single person would be Caesar's murderer. They would all be tyrannicides who had acted together to save the Republic. As they left that final meeting, the conspirators probably believed they were heroes about to perform the most patriotic act in Roman history. They had convinced themselves that killing Caesar would automatically restore republican government and return Rome to the golden age of constitutional rule. They were about to discover how completely they had misunderstood both Caesar's role in Roman politics and the consequences of removing him through violence. Section 17, the Ides of March, 200 words. The morning of March 15th, 44 BC, started with omens that should have kept Caesar home. His wife Calpurnia woke from nightmares in which she had held Caesar's bloody corpse in her arms. The sacrificial animals examined by the priests showed disturbing signs: hearts without proper chambers, entrails that predicted disaster, birds that refused to sing. Caesar himself seemed unusually subdued as he prepared for the Senate meeting. He had been suffering from more frequent epileptic seizures, and the stress of planning the Parthian campaign was taking its toll. Friends noticed that he looked older than his 55 years, with lines around his eyes and grey streaks in his thinning hair, but Caesar had never been superstitious, and he wasn't about to change his habits now. The Senate meeting was important. He needed to settle final details about governing Rome during his absence in the East. Besides, showing fear of omens would be seen as weakness by men who were already questioning his judgment. Calpurnia begged her husband to postpone the meeting. She had never asked him to avoid public duties before, but her dreams had been so vivid and terrifying that she couldn't shake the feeling that something awful was going to happen. Couldn't Caesar send word that he was ill? Surely the Senate would understand. Caesar was tempted to stay home. He had been feeling unwell, and the omens were genuinely disturbing. It would be easy enough to claim illness and reschedule the meeting for another day. But he also knew that his enemies were watching for signs of weakness or indecision. Cancelling a Senate meeting because of bad dreams would give them ammunition to use against him. While Caesar hesitated, Decimus Brutus arrived at the house to escort him to the Senate meeting. Decimus was one of Caesar's most trusted friends, a man who had served loyally through the Gallic Wars and received enormous rewards for his devotion. If Caesar trusted anyone completely, it was Decimus. Decimus listened politely to Caesar's concerns about the omens, then dismissed them with gentle mockery. Did the great Caesar, conqueror of Gaul and master of the Roman world, Really want to disappoint the Senate because his wife had a bad dream? What would people say about a leader who was afraid of bird flight patterns and animal entrails? More seriously, Decimus pointed out that the Senate was planning to offer Caesar additional honours during today's meeting, possibly including the title of king for his eastern territories. If Caesar failed to appear, the senators might interpret his absence as rejection of their honours. Some might even take offence and withdraw their support for the Parthian campaign. Caesar's vanity was touched by the suggestion that new honours awaited him. Despite his protestations about refusing royal titles, he was deeply susceptible to flattery and recognition. The idea that the Senate wanted to grant him additional powers was too tempting to ignore. Calpurnia made one final plea for Caesar to stay home, but her husband's mind was made up. He kissed her goodbye and left with Decimus, walking through Rome's streets toward his appointment with history. The journey to the Theatre of Pompey took Caesar through the heart of Rome, past the Forum where he had given his first speeches as a young lawyer, past the temples where he served as Pontifex Maximus, past the buildings he had constructed to beautify the city. Romans who recognized him called out greetings and blessings for his upcoming campaign. Caesar seemed to be in better spirits as he walked, responding to the crowd's enthusiasm with waves and smiles. The fears that had troubled him that morning were fading in the warmth of public approval. This was his city, his people, his empire. What did he have to fear from omens and dreams? As Caesar approached the Theatre of Pompey, a teacher named Artemidorus tried to press a scroll into his hands. The document contained specific details about the conspiracy, including names of the principal plotters and their plans for the Senate meeting. If Caesar had read it, the assassination would have been impossible. But Caesar was surrounded by petitioners offering scrolls, documents, and requests for favours. He handed Artemidorus's warning to one of his secretaries without reading it, just as he did with dozens of other papers every day. The information that could have saved his life was filed away with routine administrative correspondence. Inside the Theatre of Pompey, the conspirators were struggling with last-minute nerves. Seeing Caesar approach the building where they planned to kill him made the reality of their intentions suddenly vivid. This wasn't a philosophical discussion about tyranny. They were about to murder a man who had been generous to most of them personally. Some conspirators suggested postponing the attempt. Caesar looked unwell, and there were rumours that he might cancel the meeting anyway. Why not wait for a better opportunity when their nerves were steadier and their planning was more thorough? But Cassius argued that delay would only increase the chances of discovery. Too many people knew about the plot for it to remain secret much longer. If they didn't act today, they might never get another chance before Caesar left for Parthia. As Caesar entered the building, he passed directly beneath a statue of Pompey, an irony that probably wasn't lost on him. The statue depicted his former ally and eventual enemy in the pose of a conquering general, crowned with laurels and holding a scroll that listed his eastern victories. The Senate meeting began with routine business, confirmations of appointments, discussions of administrative details, reports from provincial governors. Caesar took his seat on the ivory throne that marked his position as dictator, surrounded by the chairs of senators who had once been his equals but were now effectively his subordinates. The conspirators had positioned themselves strategically around the meeting room. Some sat near Caesar's throne where they could move quickly when the signal was given. Others stationed themselves near the exits to prevent escape or interference. A few remained in their normal seats to avoid appearing suspicious. The petition that would serve as the conspirators' pretext was a request for the recall of Publius Cimber, who had been exiled for supporting Pompey during the Civil War. It was exactly the kind of routine clemency appeal that Caesar received regularly, nothing that would alarm his bodyguards or seem unusual to other senators. Tullius Cimber, Publius's brother, approached Caesar's throne and began presenting the petition in the formal language required for such requests. Caesar listened politely but indicated that he wasn't inclined to grant the recall. Cimber persisted, kneeling before Caesar's chair and continuing his appeal with increasing urgency. Other conspirators began gathering around Caesar's throne, ostensibly to support Cimber's petition, but actually to get within striking distance of their target. Caesar was now surrounded by about 20 men, though he didn't seem alarmed by their presence. Senate meetings often involved clusters of senators discussing particular issues with the dictator. Simba suddenly grabbed Caesar's toga and pulled it down from his shoulders, the agreed-upon signal for the attack to begin. Caesar was startled by the physical contact and tried to pull away, but Simba held on to the fabric, effectively restraining Caesar's movement. Casca struck the first blow, a dagger thrust aimed at Caesar's throat that missed its mark and only grazed his neck. Caesar spun around to face his attacker, blood flowing from the wound, and grabbed Casca's arm. For a moment, the two men struggled over the dagger while other senators watched in shock. Then the other conspirators moved in. Daggers flashed in the afternoon light streaming through the building's windows. Caesar tried to defend himself, but he was surrounded by armed men who had planned their attack carefully. Each conspirator struck at least one blow, sharing collective responsibility for the deed as they had agreed. Caesar fought desperately at first, using his hands and the stylus he had been holding to fend off the attackers, but the wounds were accumulating rapidly, and his strength was failing. Blood stained his white toga and pooled on the marble floor beneath his feet. The moment that broke Caesar's resistance came when he saw Marcus Brutus approaching with a raised dagger. Caesar had loved Brutus like a son, had trusted him completely, had given him every opportunity for advancement. The sight of his protege joining the attack was more devastating than any physical wound. "Kai su, teknon," Caesar said in Greek, "you too, my child." The words were more question than accusation, more sorrow than anger. Caesar couldn't believe that someone he had treated so generously could participate in his murder. Caesar stopped fighting after that. Some said he pulled his toga over his head so he wouldn't have to see his attackers' faces. Others claimed he was simply too weak from blood loss to continue resisting. Either way, he made no further attempt to defend himself as the conspirators completed their work. When the attack was over, Caesar's body lay at the foot of Pompey's statue, his blood staining the marble base. The irony would have amused him if he had been alive to appreciate it. The man who had conquered Pompey was now dead beneath his rival's image, killed by Romans who claimed to be defending the Republic that both men had helped destroy. The conspirators stood over Caesar's corpse, holding their bloody daggers and trying to comprehend what they had accomplished. 23 wounds marked Caesar's body, though only one, a thrust between the ribs that pierced his heart, had been immediately fatal. The others were testimony to the conspirators' determination to share responsibility for the deed. But even as the conspirators prepared to announce their success to Rome, something was going wrong with their carefully planned revolution. Instead of cheering the death of a tyrant, the senators who had witnessed the assassination were fleeing in terror. Some crawled under their chairs to avoid being seen. Others ran for the exits, shouting that Rome was under attack by assassins. The conspirators had expected to be hailed as liberators who had saved the Republic from autocracy. Instead, they found themselves standing alone in an empty meeting room with Caesar's corpse, while panicked Romans spread word throughout the city that their dictator had been murdered by a senatorial conspiracy. Marcus Brutus tried to address the few senators who remained, explaining that they had acted to restore republican government and protect Roman liberty. But his words fell on deaf ears. The men who heard him were thinking about their own safety, not about constitutional principles or political philosophy. The conspirators began to realize that they had made a fatal miscalculation. Killing Caesar hadn't automatically restored the Republic. It had simply created a power vacuum that someone else would have to fill. And they had no plan for what should happen next beyond vague hopes that Republican institutions would somehow resume normal functioning. As news of the assassination spread through Rome's streets, the conspirators discovered just how badly they had misunderstood the political situation. The people who poured into the forum weren't celebrating Caesar's death. They were mourning the loss of a leader who had given them jobs, entertainment, and hope for a better future. Caesar was dead. But the Republic the conspirators thought they were saving had died with him. Section 18. After the assassination, 900 words. The conspirators had spent months planning Caesar's murder, but they had given almost no thought to what would happen afterward. They seemed to believe that killing the dictator would automatically restore republican government, as if Caesar's death would magically erase 20 years of civil war and constitutional breakdown. Within hours of the assassination, it became clear how naive this assumption had been. The first sign of trouble was the reaction of ordinary Romans. Instead of celebrating their liberation from tyranny, people were gathering in angry crowds demanding to know who had killed their benefactor. Caesar had been genuinely popular with Rome's masses, who remembered his generous games, his building projects that provided employment, and his expansion of citizenship that gave them dignity and opportunities. The conspirators had barricaded themselves on the Capitoline Hill, the traditional refuge for politicians in crisis. From there, they sent messages to the Forum trying to explain their actions and rally support for Republican restoration, but their proclamations fell flat. Most Romans didn't care about constitutional theory. They cared about practical benefits, and Caesar had provided those in abundance. Marcus Brutus, as the conspiracy's most respected member, attempted to address the people directly. He climbed down from the Capitoline and spoke in the Forum, explaining that Caesar's death had been necessary to preserve Roman liberty. The crowd listened politely but without enthusiasm. When Brutus finished speaking, someone called out, "What happens to Caesar's promises to us? Who will complete his building projects? Who will provide for Caesar's veterans?" Brutus had no good answers to these practical questions. The conspirators had focused so completely on the moral necessity of removing Caesar that they had ignored the administrative chaos his death would create. Caesar hadn't just been a political leader, he had been the center of a vast patronage network that employed thousands of Romans and funded countless projects throughout the empire. The situation became more dangerous when Mark Antony, Caesar's closest surviving ally, began organizing a response. Antony had fled Rome immediately after the assassination, fearing that the conspirators planned to kill Caesar's supporters as well. But when it became clear that the plot had targeted only Caesar himself, Antony returned to the city and began asserting his authority as surviving consul. Antony's first priority was securing Caesar's papers and personal effects. As consul, he had legal authority to take custody of government documents, but he was really looking for Caesar's will and any other materials that might be useful in the coming power struggle. What he found exceeded his expectations. Caesar's will revealed the dictator's genuine affection for ordinary Romans. He left his private gardens to the Roman people as a public park. Every Roman citizen would receive a cash payment from his personal fortune. His villa across the Tiber would become a public building. Even his assassins were remembered. Brutus was named as a secondary heir, showing that Caesar had continued to trust him despite growing political tensions. But the will's most explosive provision was Caesar's adoption of his grandnephew Gaius Octavius as his son and primary heir. The 18-year-old boy would inherit not just Caesar's vast wealth, but also his political connections, veteran loyalties, and claim to leadership of the Caesarian faction. Octavius would take the name Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus, forever linking himself to the murdered dictator's legacy. Antony also found something else among Caesar's papers, detailed plans for the Parthian campaign that revealed the extraordinary scope of Caesar's ambitions. The Eastern expedition wasn't just intended to avenge Crassus's defeat, it was designed to conquer territory all the way to India, adding vast new provinces to the Roman Empire and securing Caesar's position as history's greatest conqueror. These discoveries gave Antony powerful weapons to use against the conspirators. Caesar hadn't been a tyrant seeking to destroy the Republic. He had been a visionary planning to expand Roman power and share the benefits with ordinary citizens. His assassination wasn't an act of liberation, but a crime that had deprived Rome of its greatest leader and most generous benefactor. The reading of Caesar's will took place several days after the assassination, and its provisions transformed public opinion completely. Romans who had been uncertain about Caesar's death now saw it as a personal loss that had cost them money, jobs, and opportunities. The conspirators weren't heroes. They were murderers who had killed the one leader who actually cared about ordinary people's welfare. Antony's funeral oration for Caesar became the turning point in public sentiment. Speaking in the Forum before a crowd that included many of Caesar's veterans, Antony reminded his audience of everything Caesar had accomplished for Rome and for them personally. He displayed Caesar's blood-stained toga, pointing out each rent made by the conspirators' daggers. He read from Caesar's will, emphasizing the generosity towards citizens who had lost their protector. The speech wasn't the rhetorical masterpiece that Shakespeare would later imagine, but it was devastatingly effective political theatre. By the time Antony finished speaking, the crowd was ready for violence against anyone associated with Caesar's murder. The funeral itself became a riot. Caesar's body was supposed to be cremated in a ceremony outside the city walls, following traditional Roman custom. Instead, the mourners built a pyre in the forum itself, using broken furniture, wooden benches, and anything else that would burn. Veterans threw their decorations and weapons onto the flames. Women added their jewellery and children's toys. As the fire grew higher, someone in the crowd shouted, "Burn the houses of the murderers!" Within minutes, mobs were racing through Rome's streets looking for the conspirators and their supporters. Several houses were attacked and looted. Some of Caesar's assassins barely escaped with their lives. The violence continued for days. Anyone suspected of supporting the conspiracy was in danger from crowds that had turned Caesar into a martyr and his killers into demons. The conspirators, still barricaded on the Capitol and Hill, watched their hoped-for restoration of Republican government dissolve into chaos and mob rule. But the most ominous development for the conspirators was the arrival of Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir. The young man had been studying in Greece when news of his adoption reached him. Against the advice of friends who warned that returning to Rome would be dangerous, Octavian sailed immediately for Italy to claim his inheritance. Octavian was only 18 years old, with no military experience and no political base beyond his connection to Caesar. Most observers expected Antony to push the boy aside and claim leadership of the Caesarian faction for himself. But Octavian surprised everyone by displaying political skills that seemed to come from nowhere. First, Octavian insisted on being called by his new name, Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus. He wasn't just Caesar's heir, he was Caesar's son, entitled to all the loyalty and respect that relationship commanded. When Caesar's veterans heard that their beloved general had adopted a son, many transferred their allegiance to the boy automatically. Second, Octavian began paying Caesar's bequests to Roman citizens from his own resources, even though Antony was blocking access to the official estate. The gesture cost Octavian enormous amounts of money, but it showed ordinary Romans that someone was honouring Caesar's promises, while his assassins offered them nothing but abstract theories about republican government. Most importantly, Octavian made it clear that he intended to pursue justice for Caesar's murder. Unlike the conspirators, who seemed paralysed by the consequences of their actions, or Antony, who was more interested in political advantage than revenge, Octavian focused single-mindedly on punishing the men who had killed his adoptive father. The appearance of Caesar's comet in the summer of 44 BC provided the perfect symbol for Octavian's campaign. A bright star appeared in the daytime sky during games celebrating Caesar's victories, visible for 7 consecutive days. Romans interpreted it as proof that Caesar had been welcomed among the gods. He wasn't just a murdered politician, but a divine figure whose death demanded supernatural vengeance. Octavian encouraged this interpretation, claiming that the comet showed Caesar's approval of his heir's actions. The boy who would become Augustus was learning to manipulate religious sentiment and popular superstition with skills that would serve him throughout his career. Meanwhile, the conspirators were discovering that republican restoration was impossible without popular support and military power. They controlled neither. Caesar's veterans despised them for killing their beloved commander. Ordinary citizens blamed them for destroying their source of benefits and employment. Even conservative senators were reluctant to associate with men who had resorted to assassination to achieve political goals. Some conspirators began fleeing Rome for distant provinces, where they might build military forces to protect themselves. Others attempted to rally republican sentiment through speeches and pamphlets that portrayed Caesar as a tyrant whose removal had saved Roman liberty. But their arguments convinced almost no one outside the small circle of senators who had already opposed Caesar's rule. The conspiracy that was supposed to restore the Republic had instead created conditions for its final destruction. Caesar's death had removed the one leader who might have been able to govern the empire through existing institutions, however modified. In his place emerged rivals who would fight for supremacy until only one remained. Antony controlled Caesar's papers, the consulship, and immediate access to government resources. Octavian commanded Caesar's name, his inheritance, and the loyalty of many veterans. The conspirators held abstract principles and the support of a few traditionalist senators. The balance of power was already shifting toward the Caesarians, who offered practical benefits and emotional satisfaction to Romans grieving for their murdered leader. The Republic was dead, killed not by Caesar's autocracy, but by the assassination that was supposed to save it. What emerged from the chaos would be something entirely different, an empire ruled by emperors who claimed to restore republican values while exercising powers that made Caesar look like a moderate reformer. The conspirators had succeeded in killing Caesar, but they had failed completely in their larger goal of preventing one-man rule in Rome. Instead, they had made it inevitable by demonstrating that republican institutions were too weak to survive determined opposition from men willing to use violence for political ends. Caesar was dead. Long live Caesar. The 18-year-old who arrived in Rome to claim Caesar's inheritance didn't look like much of a threat. Octavian was pale, thin, and often sick with stomach problems that kept him in bed for days at a time. He had never commanded troops, never held political office, never given a speech in the Forum. Most Romans saw him as Caesar's spoiled grandnephew trying to cash in on a famous name. They were making a fatal mistake. Octavian might have looked like a sickly teenager, but he had inherited more than Caesar's money and name. He had also inherited his adoptive father's political genius, along with a ruthless streak that Caesar himself had never possessed. The boy who seemed so fragile would prove more dangerous than any of the hardened generals who thought they could push him aside. Octavian's first move was brilliant in its simplicity. Instead of challenging Antony directly for leadership of the Caesarian faction, he positioned himself as Caesar's faithful son seeking justice for his murdered father. This wasn't about personal ambition, it was about family duty and religious obligation. The strategy worked because it appealed to Caesar's veterans in terms they could relate to. These men had loved Caesar like a father. They had followed him from Gaul to Egypt, sharing dangers and dividing spoils with a commander who knew their names and cared about their welfare. When that beloved general adopted a son, the veterans felt obligated to protect the boy and help him claim his rightful inheritance. Antony initially tried to ignore Octavian, treating him as a minor nuisance who would fade away once the novelty wore off. But Octavian refused to be ignored. He appeared at public ceremonies wearing Caesar's signet ring. He spoke in the Forum about his duty to honor his father's memory. He began paying Caesar's promised bequest to Roman citizens from his own funds, making Antony look stingy by comparison. More importantly, Octavian started recruiting Caesar's veterans with promises that he would complete his father's unfinished business. Caesar's Eastern campaign would proceed under new leadership. The men who had served loyally would receive the land grants and bonuses Caesar had promised. The dictator's vision of expanded Roman power would be fulfilled by his faithful heir. The veterans responded enthusiastically to Octavian's message. Here was someone who spoke their language and shared their values. Unlike the conspirators, who offered them abstract theories about republican government, or even Antony, who seemed more interested in his own career than Caesar's legacy, Octavian promised to continue the policies that had made Caesar's soldiers rich and successful. But Octavian also learned from Caesar's mistakes. Where Caesar had been merciful to defeated enemies, Octavian would be ruthless. Where Caesar had tried to work within republican institutions, Octavian would sweep them aside when they became inconvenient. Where Caesar had trusted friends and allies, Octavian would eliminate anyone who might become a rival. The first test of Octavian's ruthlessness came when he formed the Second Triumvirate with Antony and Lepidus in 43 BC. Unlike the secret alliance that had launched Caesar's career, this triumvirate was official and legal, with powers granted by popular assemblies that the three men controlled completely. But the new triumvirate's first act showed how different it was from Caesar's approach to political opposition. Instead of pardoning their enemies, the triumvirs published proscription lists, death sentences for hundreds of Romans who had opposed them or simply owned property the triumvirs wanted to confiscate. The proscriptions were coldly systematic. Each triumvir was allowed to list his personal enemies for execution. Antony put Cicero at the top of his list, finally getting revenge on the orator who had attacked him in the Philippics. Lepidus added various senators who had questioned his competence. Octavian, despite his youth, proved the most ruthless of all, listing men who had merely been neutral during the civil wars. Cicero's death was particularly brutal. The great orator was caught trying to flee Italy and killed by Antony's soldiers, who cut off his head and hands as proof of their success. Antony's wife Fulvia reportedly stabbed Cicero's tongue with hairpins, getting revenge for all the speeches that had attacked her husband. The proscriptions killed thousands of Romans and destroyed entire families that had opposed the triumvirs. It was exactly the kind of systematic revenge that Caesar had tried to avoid through his clemency policy. But Octavian understood something Caesar hadn't. Mercy was a luxury that could only be afforded by leaders who were completely secure in their power. With their enemies eliminated and their finances restored through confiscated property, the triumvirs turned their attention to the conspirators who had killed Caesar. Brutus and Cassius had fled to the eastern provinces, where they were raising armies and claiming to represent the legitimate Roman government in exile. The final confrontation came at Philippi in Macedonia in 42 BC. The battle was actually two separate engagements fought 3 weeks apart, both ending in republican defeats that destroyed the last organized resistance to triumviral rule. Brutus and Cassius commanded about 100,000 men, a formidable force that included veteran legions and auxiliary troops from throughout the eastern Mediterranean. But their army was divided by the same philosophical disputes that had plagued the conspiracy from the beginning. Some officers wanted to fight aggressively, others preferred defensive tactics, and many were simply tired of a civil war that seemed to have no end. The triumviral army was smaller but more unified. Antony commanded the main force, while Octavian, still recovering from illness, provided strategic direction and handled logistics. Their soldiers fought for practical rewards, land grants, bonus payments, and shares of plunder, rather than abstract principles about republican government. The first battle at Philippi was a draw, with both sides claiming victory. Cassius's forces overran Octavian's camp, while Brutus defeated Antony's left wing. But Cassius, thinking the entire battle was lost, committed suicide rather than face capture. His death demoralized the Republican army and eliminated one of their most competent commanders. 3 weeks later, the surviving Republicans were forced to fight again when their supply situation became desperate. This time, Antony's tactical superiority and the triumvir's superior resources proved decisive. Brutus's army was crushed completely, with most of the Republican leadership killed or captured. Brutus himself survived the battle but realized that further resistance was hopeless. Like his ancestor, who had driven out the last king, he chose death over submission to autocracy. He convinced one of his servants to hold a sword while he fell upon it, reportedly saying, "Virtue, I have followed you through life, but you are only a name." The deaths of Brutus and Cassius at Philippi marked the end of the Roman Republic as a viable form of government. The men who had killed Caesar to preserve republican institutions were now dead themselves, defeated by Caesar's heir and his allies. The conspiracy that was supposed to restore traditional government had instead guaranteed its permanent destruction. But Octavian's victory at Philippi was just the beginning of his rise to supreme power. He still had to deal with Antony, who commanded larger forces and controlled the wealthy eastern provinces. The partnership that had defeated the Republicans would inevitably turn into rivalry, as both men sought to inherit Caesar's position as Rome's sole ruler. The break between Octavian and Antony developed gradually over several years. Initially they divided the Roman world between them. Octavian took the west, Antony took the east, and Lepidus was given Africa as a consolation prize. But this arrangement was inherently unstable because both men had the same ultimate goal: to become the next Caesar. Antony's relationship with Cleopatra provided Octavian with the perfect weapon to use against his rival. The Egyptian queen had borne Caesar a son and represented everything Romans feared about Eastern influence on their leaders. When Antony began living with Cleopatra in Alexandria and adopted Egyptian royal customs, Octavian portrayed him as a traitor who had abandoned Roman values for foreign decadence. The propaganda war between Octavian and Antony was as important as their military preparations. Octavian presented himself as Caesar's true heir, the defender of Roman traditions against Eastern corruption. Antony was depicted as a drunk and a puppet of a foreign queen who planned to rule Rome from Alexandria. But Octavian's most effective weapon was his patience. Where Antony was impulsive and emotional, Octavian was calculating and methodical. He waited for the perfect moment to strike, building his strength while his rival made mistakes that could be exploited. The final confrontation came when Antony's political position in Rome became untenable. Octavian had convinced the Senate to declare war on Cleopatra, not on Antony directly, which would have looked like another civil war, but on the foreign queen who was supposedly controlling him. It was a clever legal fiction that allowed Octavian to present himself as defending Rome against foreign invasion, rather than fighting another Roman general. Octavian had learned everything Caesar could have taught him about political manipulation, military leadership, and the ruthless pursuit of power. But he had also learned from Caesar's mistakes, particularly the importance of eliminating enemies permanently, rather than hoping they could be won over through generosity. The boy who'd arrived in Rome as Caesar's unknown heir was now ready to complete his adoptive father's transformation of the Roman world. Unlike Caesar, who had tried to preserve republican forms while exercising autocratic power, Octavian was prepared to create entirely new institutions that would make one-man rule both permanent and acceptable to Romans, who still valued their traditional freedoms. Caesar had shown that the Republic could be conquered. Octavian would prove that it could be replaced with something better. Section 20. The Empire Caesar Never Saw, 2400 words. The final war between Octavian and Antony was decided not on land but at sea, in a naval battle that would determine the future of Western civilization. The Battle of Actium, fought off the coast of Greece on September 2nd, 31 BC, was supposed to be a climactic showdown between two massive fleets. Instead, it became a rout that ended when Cleopatra fled the battlefield with her ships, and Antony followed her into exile and defeat. Antony's flight from Actium wasn't cowardice. It was the desperate decision of a man who saw his entire world collapsing. His ships were outnumbered and outmaneuvered by Octavian's Admiral Agrippa. His land forces were deserting to the enemy. His Roman allies were abandoning him for the winner. Following Cleopatra to Egypt might have been his only chance to regroup and continue the fight. But the flight looked like abandonment to Romans, who expected their leaders to die gloriously rather than retreat ignominiously. Antony's reputation never recovered from Actium. The man who had been Caesar's most trusted lieutenant, who had delivered the funeral oration that turned Rome against the conspirators, was now seen as a coward who had chosen a foreign woman over Roman honour. Octavian pursued his defeated rivals to Alexandria, where the final act of the civil wars played out against the backdrop of Egypt's ancient splendour. Antony and Cleopatra had months to prepare their defences, but they knew the end was inevitable. Octavian commanded the loyalty of virtually every Roman legion still in existence. Egypt's wealth and Cleopatra's charisma couldn't overcome that kind of military superiority. The last queen of Egypt chose death on her own terms rather than life as Octavian's prisoner. Cleopatra's suicide by acid bite became legendary, though the truth was probably less dramatic. She likely used poison provided by her physicians, rather than relying on a snake's uncertain venom. Antony fell on his sword in the traditional Roman manner, finally remembering his origins after years of Egyptian luxury. Their deaths eliminated the last obstacles to Octavian's supreme power. At 32 years old, Caesar's heir had accomplished what his adoptive father never managed: the complete elimination of all rivals and the undisputed mastery of the Roman world. The civil wars that had torn the Mediterranean apart for decades were finally over. But Octavian's greatest challenge still lay ahead. Winning power was one thing. Keeping it was another. Caesar had conquered the Roman world only to be murdered by men who claimed to be defending republican values. How could Octavian avoid the same fate while exercising the same autocratic authority that had gotten Caesar killed? Octavian's solution was brilliant in its subtlety. Instead of ruling as dictator like Caesar, he would become something new, a princeps, or first citizen, who exercised imperial power while maintaining the fiction that republican institutions still functioned normally. The Senate would continue to meet, magistrates would still be elected, and laws would be passed through traditional assemblies. But everyone would understand that the princeps made the real decisions. In 27 BC, Octavian formally restored the Republic by returning his emergency powers to the Senate and people of Rome. It was pure theatre. He kept control of the army, the treasury, and the most important provinces, but it allowed Romans to pretend they still lived in a free state while accepting the practical benefits of one-man rule. The Senate rewarded Octavian's modesty by granting him a new name, Augustus, meaning the revered one. It was a religious title that implied divine favour without claiming actual godhood. Augustus wasn't a king or dictator. He was someone blessed by the gods to guide Rome toward its destined greatness. The transformation from Octavian to Augustus marked the birth of the Roman Empire, though nobody called it that at the time. Augustus and his successors were officially emperors, military commanders who happened to hold various republican offices simultaneously. The fiction was maintained for centuries, even as the reality of autocratic rule became increasingly obvious. Augustus succeeded where Caesar had failed because he understood that Romans would accept one-man rule as long as it was disguised as something else. Caesar had been too honest about his power, too willing to break openly with republican traditions. Augustus was more subtle, preserving the forms of the old system while quietly gutting its substance. But Augustus also implemented many of Caesar's unrealized plans with remarkable success. He completed the conquest of Spain and extended Roman control into Germany and the Balkans. He established colonies for Caesar's veterans throughout the empire, spreading Roman culture and creating loyal populations in frontier regions. He reformed the army, the administration, and the legal system along lines Caesar had sketched but never fully developed. Most importantly, Augustus made Caesar's vision of a multicultural empire a reality. He continued extending citizenship to deserving provincials, appointed talented foreigners to important positions, and treated conquered peoples as potential Romans rather than permanent subjects. The empire Augustus created was more inclusive and stable than anything the old republic could have managed. Augustus also ensured that Caesar's name would outlive them both. He called himself Divi Filius, son of the divine Julius, linking his authority to his adoptive father's posthumous deification. Caesar became a god whose heir ruled in his name, making Augustus's power both hereditary and sacred. The name Caesar itself became synonymous with absolute power in dozens of languages. German Kaisers, Russian Tsars, and Persian Shahs all traced their titles back to the Roman dictator, who had crossed the Rubicon 2,000 years earlier. Even today we use Caesar as a generic term for powerful leaders and surgical procedures named after the emperor supposedly born by caesarean section. Caesar's literary legacy was equally enduring. His commentaries on the Gallic Wars became the standard textbook for students learning Latin, admired for their clear, precise prose and objective tone. Military academies studied his tactics, engineers analysed his siege works, and politicians learned from his speeches. Caesar's writing style influenced authors from Cicero to Churchill, setting the standard for clear, effective communication that remains relevant today. But perhaps Caesar's most important legacy was the questions his life raised about the nature of power and leadership. Was he a visionary who saved Rome from chaos, or a tyrant who destroyed the Republic? Did his assassination preserve liberty or guarantee its destruction? Could the Roman world have evolved peacefully toward imperial government, or was violent revolution inevitable? These questions remain relevant because every generation faces similar choices between freedom and security, tradition and innovation, gradual reform and revolutionary change. Caesar's story endures because it captures something eternal about human nature and political power that transcends the specific circumstances of ancient Rome. The empire Augustus built in Caesar's name lasted for centuries in the West and over a millennium in the East. Roman law, Roman engineering, Roman administration, and Roman culture spread throughout Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East, creating a civilization that influenced every subsequent development in Western history. Christianity spread through the Roman road system Caesar and Augustus had built. The Renaissance rediscovered classical learning preserved in Roman libraries. The Enlightenment drew inspiration from Roman legal principles and governmental institutions. Modern democracies incorporated Roman concepts of citizenship, representation, and constitutional government. But the empire also demonstrated the costs of one-man rule. Augustus's successors included madmen like Caligula, perverts like Nero, and incompetents like Honorius, who presided over Rome's decline and fall. The system Caesar and Augustus created was only as good as the men who operated it, and not all of them were worthy of the power they inherited. The Roman Empire's eventual collapse vindicated some of the conspirators' concerns about the dangers of autocracy. When strong emperors ruled, the system worked brilliantly. When weak or corrupt men held power, there were no constitutional mechanisms to remove them peacefully. The Republic's messy, inefficient institutions had at least provided regular opportunities for peaceful leadership changes. Yet even the empire's collapse couldn't diminish Caesar's influence. Medieval kings claimed descent from Roman emperors, Renaissance artists depicted Caesar as the ideal ruler, and Enlightenment philosophers debated whether his assassination was justified. Napoleon consciously modelled himself on Caesar, even crowning himself emperor in conscious imitation of his Roman predecessor. American founding fathers studied Caesar's career carefully, learning both positive and negative lessons from his example. They admired his military genius and administrative skills while fearing the concentration of power that had enabled his autocracy. The constitutional system they created was designed to prevent any American leader from accumulating Caesar-like authority over the military, finances, and government. But Americans also borrowed heavily from Caesar's political methods. Presidential campaigns used many of the same techniques Caesar pioneered: direct appeals to ordinary citizens, careful management of public image, and the systematic cultivation of personal loyalty among supporters. Modern political leaders still quote Caesar's writings and claim his example when they want to appear decisive and effective. Caesar's influence extends far beyond politics into literature, art, film, and popular culture. Shakespeare's Julius Caesar remains one of the most frequently performed plays in the English language. Countless novels, movies, and television shows have retold his story or used him as a character. The phrase, "crossing the Rubicon," has become shorthand for making an irreversible decision that changes everything. Even people who know little about ancient history recognize Caesar's name and associate it with power, ambition, and historical significance. He has become an archetype: the successful general who becomes a political leader, the reformer who goes too far, the strong man who saves his country by destroying its freedom. The man who crossed a shallow Italian river on a winter night in 49 BC could never have imagined how completely his name and story would penetrate human consciousness. Caesar thought he was solving the immediate problems of Roman politics. Instead, he created a template for power that has influenced every subsequent civilization. Augustus built the empire, but Caesar provided the vision, the methods, and the example that made it possible. The boy emperor who became the first Caesar's heir was simply completing a revolution that began when his adoptive father decided that the die was cast and led his army across the Rubicon toward Rome.